Chapter 1. The Looming Threat. The first light of dawn broke over the sprawling expanse of Silver Creek Ranch, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. The scent of damp earth and morning dew clung to the air, mingling with the lingering smell of hay and horses. Inside the barn, Evelyn Evie Chandler knelt beside a weak, shivering calf, her hands slick with a mixture of salve and sweat. The animal's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, its eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "Come on, little fella," Evie murmured, smoothing a hand over the calf's velvety hide. She reached for the bottle of warmed milk she had prepared, pressing the nipple gently against the animal's mouth. "You need to drink." The calf barely responded. Evie bit her lower lip, frustration and worry knotting in her belly. This wasn't the first calf she'd nursed, but lately everything at Silver Creek felt like an uphill battle. With their herd already thin from a season of drought, every loss chipped away at their survival. She adjusted her posture, wincing as the strain in her lower back made itself known. Her body ached from days, weeks, no, months, of working before dawn and long after sunset. The once thriving ranch had been whittled down to its bare bones. Money was tight. Hands had left. The weight of it all pressed heavy on her shoulders. Still, she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. A breeze stirred the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid, carrying with it the faint creak of the front porch swing and the rhythmic sound of boot heels scuffing wood. Her father. Evie exhaled slowly before rising, wiping her hands on her apron. Jed Chandler didn't come outside much these days, not since his leg injury had robbed him of the ability to ride for long stretches. The old man was stubborn as a mule, but lately his fight had dimmed, leaving him a shadow of the man he once was. When she reached the porch, she found him seated in his usual spot, rocking slightly, a cup of coffee cradled in his gnarled hands. His once broad shoulders slumped beneath the weight of exhaustion, his grey-streaked hair unkempt, his beard overdue for a trim. His expression was distant, the way it often was when he thought she wasn't looking. "You been out there all morning again?" he asked, his voice rasping with disuse. "Isn't have much of a choice," Evie said, propping a hip against the railing. "We lost 2 heifers last week. Can't afford to lose another." Jed's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took a slow sip from his cup, gaze fixed on the horizon. Evie knew that look. Something was wrong. Before she could ask, the distant thump of hooves carried across the hard-packed dirt road leading to the house. Evie turned toward the sound, her pulse quickening. A lone rider approached, dust trailing in his wake. As he neared, she recognized the man as Bill Thatcher, one of the clerks at the local bank. Her stomach dropped. Nothing good ever came from a banker riding out first thing in the morning. Jed sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this." Evie shot him a sharp look. "You knew he was coming?" Jed didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his cane and pushed himself to his feet with a wince. Evie stepped forward to help him, but he waved her off. Bill Thatcher reined in his horse at the bottom of the steps, tipping his hat. "Morning, Jed, Miss Evie." "Bill," Jed greeted gruffly. Evie crossed her arms over her chest. "What brings you all the way out here?" Bill's moustache twitched as he shifted in his saddle. "I ain't one for beating around the bush, so I'll come right out with it. The bank's calling in the loan. You've got 60 days to settle your debt or the ranch gets handed over." A slow chill crept down Evie's spine. She stole a glance at Jed, expecting him to react, to argue, to demand an extension, but he only nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. Her chest tightened. 60 days? We were supposed to have until the end of the year. "Was," Bill said, sighing. "But circumstances changed. The bank accepted an offer on the debt. If you can't pay, the ranch goes to the highest bidder." Evie's stomach twisted. "Who made the offer?" Bill hesitated before answering. "Luther Colton." A thick silence settled over the porch. Jed sank back into his chair, shoulders sagging. "Damn snake," he muttered under his breath. Evie's hands clenched into fists. Luther Colton was more than a competitor. He was a vulture, circling, waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and take what wasn't his. She turned her glare on Bill. The bank can't do this. Bill sighed again, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't like it either, Miss Evie, but it's legal. And Colton's sending someone out to survey the land. You'll be getting a visit soon. Jed closed his eyes for a long moment before finally opening them, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. Who's he sending? Bill hesitated before answering. Boone Colton. The name hit Evie like a punch to the gut. Boone Colton was Luther's adopted nephew, a man as infamous as he was respected. He wasn't known for playing dirty, but he was a Colton, and that made him dangerous. If he was coming, it meant Luther was serious about taking Silver Creek. Bill adjusted his reins. I'm real sorry, folks. If I had any say, things would be different. Jed waved him off. Ain't your fault. Evie, however, wasn't so quick to let it go. Tell your boss we're not done yet. We'll have that money before the deadline. Bill gave her a sympathetic look, but didn't argue. Instead, he tipped his hat again and rode off, leaving nothing but silence and a cloud of dust in his wake. Evie turned to her father. You knew, didn't you? Jed exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. I suspected. The bank's been tightening the noose for months. Her mind whirled. 60 days. It wasn't enough time. Not unless they could pull off a miracle. And if they failed... She swallowed hard, gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. We have to fight, Pa. We can't let them take Silver Creek. Jed's weary eyes met hers. And how do you suppose we do that, Evie? She had no idea, not yet. But she would. One thing was certain. She wouldn't let Luther Colton steal her home. And she sure as hell wouldn't let Boone Colton be the man to take it from her. The morning sun burned away the last wisps of mist curling over Silver Creek Ranch, its golden light stretching long fingers over the pastures. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs lost beneath the creak of the windmill and the restless lowing of cattle. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick, not with dust or the scent of brewing coffee, but with tension. Evie set a steaming plate of eggs and biscuits in front of Jed Chandler, her father, before settling into the chair opposite him at the heavy oak table. Her stomach clenched at the sight of him. His once powerful frame had thinned, his movements slowed by age and the lingering pain of his old injury. The weight of worry sat on his shoulders like a yoke, and this morning it seemed heavier than ever. She wasn't hungry, but she forced herself to pick at her meal, gathering her thoughts like a gambler arranging her cards before placing a high-stakes bet. Jed shoveled a bite of eggs into his mouth, but didn't meet her gaze. He already knew what was coming. You should have told me, she said, keeping her voice even. Jed sighed, setting his fork down. Evie, we only have 60 days to come up with the money, pal, she pressed, unable to keep the edge from her voice. You've had weeks, maybe months, to tell me things were this bad. And instead I had to find out from a bank messenger that Colton already made an offer. Her father's jaw worked as if he were chewing over his words. I didn't tell you because there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. Evie's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Maybe I could have if I'd known sooner. Jed scoffed. And what would you have done? The truth is, there ain't no way out of this, not unless you've got a pot of gold hid somewhere I don't know about. There has to be a way. Jed rubbed a hand over his weathered face. There's one option, but it's a fool's gamble. Evie straightened. Tell me. Jed hesitated, then exhaled heavily. There's a clause in the contract, one that gives us a chance to pay off the loan without selling. Evie's heart kicked up a beat. What clause? If we can drive 500 head of cattle to the railhead at Bent Willow before the deadline, we can pay the debt and keep Silver Creek. She sat back, her mind already spinning. 500 was a lot, more than they'd ever moved at once. And with so many of their hired hands gone, they barely had enough men to keep up with daily chores, let alone pull off a cattle drive of that size. Jed gave her a hard look. I know what you're thinking, but it ain't possible. We don't have the men, we don't have the resources, and even if we could pull it off, there's Boone Colton coming to size up our land. That boy is smart. He won't make it easy for us. Evie swallowed. She knew Boone's reputation. Level-headed, tough, and dangerously competent. "You've already given up," she accused. "I'm being realistic." "I'm being realistic too," she shot back. "And realism says if we don't fight for Silver Creek, we lose it." Jed studied her for a long moment. "Even if you had the men, who's going to lead 'em?" Evie opened her mouth to argue, but Jed shook his head. "No man out here's going to follow a woman into something this dangerous." The words stung more than they should have. She clenched her fists beneath the table. She had ridden the trails, broken horses, mended fences, and hauled feed just as well as any man. But it didn't matter. In their world, a woman couldn't lead a cattle drive. No man would follow her. Jed leaned forward, eyes softening. "I know it ain't fair, but that's the way it is." The injustice of it burned deep. She pushed away from the table and stood. "I need some air." Evie strode out onto the porch, inhaling deeply as the crisp morning air filled her lungs. The ranch stretched before her, a kingdom she was meant to inherit, if only the world would let her. A 500-head cattle drive. It was madness. It was impossible. And yet, her gaze fell on the old barn, where the family's store of ledgers and maps was kept. Without thinking, she strode inside, brushing dust from the large wooden desk. The scent of old paper and leather-bound books filled her nose as she flipped through pages of livestock counts, debts, and sales records. She did the math, over and over again. They had the cattle, they had the time, if... It was a mighty big if. She could hire enough men to handle the job. She leaned back, gnawing on her lower lip. Hiring wranglers cost money. Silver Creek was already drowning in debt. A thought flickered. What if they didn't know she was a woman? She nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Then again, she caught sight of her reflection in the dusty glass of the window, beneath the soft features and loose braid. She wasn't that different from her late brother. Her jawline was strong enough, her build lean and wiry like a young ranch hand's. And if she bound her chest, wore looser clothes, a wild, impossible idea took root. If she disguised herself as a man, she could hire on a crew without them questioning her authority. Her heart pounded in her chest. Could she really do it? She glanced down at her calloused hands, her skin brown from years under the sun. She already worked harder than half the men in town. Maybe she could. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to save Silver Creek. Evie climbed the stairs to her room, her pulse hammering in her ears. The moment she stepped inside, her gaze landed on the wooden trunk in the corner, the one filled with her brother's old things. She knelt beside it, running her fingers over the lid before pushing it open. Dust and memory swirled around her as she pulled out a well-worn cowboy hat, a faded button-down shirt, and a pair of rugged canvas pants. One by one, she donned them. The fit was looser than expected, but that worked in her favor. She bound her chest as tightly as she could stand and tucked her braid beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Her breath hitched as she turned to the cracked mirror above her wash-basin. She hardly recognized herself. The softness was gone from her face, replaced by sharp angles and rugged lines. If she kept her head low, wore her hat just right, and spoke a little deeper, it could work. She flexed her fingers, testing the feel of her brother's old gloves. This wasn't just a disguise. It was a chance to save her home, a chance to prove she was every bit as capable as the men who doubted her. A slow, determined smile crept onto her lips. "Evan Chandler," she murmured, testing the name. It felt right. She squared her shoulders, the weight of doubt replaced by something sharper. She had a plan, and soon enough she'd have a crew. With one last glance in the mirror, Evan Chandler, stepped out into the world, and the fight for Silver Creek began. The midday sun burned hot over Silver Creek Ranch, baking the dirt yard into cracked earth and sending waves of heat shimmering over the landscape. A stiff breeze kicked up the scent of dust and horsesweat, making the air thick and dry. Evie strode purposefully across the yard, adjusting the brim of her hat and tugging at the too loose waistband of her brother's old trousers. They sat uncomfortably low on her hips, despite the belt cinched tight around her waist. She had to hitch them up every few steps, which was an inconvenience she hadn't quite anticipated when she'd decided to become Ivan. She spotted old Buck by the corral, leaning against the weathered railing with an air of unshakable ease, chewing on a piece of straw. The veteran ranch hand was as old as time itself, with a wiry frame and skin like tanned leather, the kind that had been baked under too many decades of sun. His beard was a peppered mix of grey and white, and his deep-set eyes, always sharp, missed nothing. If she was going to pull off this ridiculous plan, she needed someone who knew the land, knew the men, and, most importantly, could keep a damn secret. And there wasn't a soul more trustworthy than Buck. Evie stopped beside him, folding her arms over her chest, trying to mirror his relaxed stance. Unfortunately, one of her brother's oversized boots decided that was a good time to slip halfway off her foot. She caught herself before stumbling, but not before Buck let out a low chuckle. "Ha ha! Well now," he drawled, not even glancing her way. "That's an interesting look for you, Miss Evie." She scowled, hitching up her pants again. "Don't start. Ain't starting nothing." He tipped his hat back, finally turning his full attention on her. His gaze roamed over her, from the too loose shirt down to the boots that made her feet look comically large, before landing on her face. His eyes twinkled with something dangerously close to amusement. "You trying to get mistaken for a scarecrow?" Evie exhaled through her nose. "I need your help." "That so?" "Yes." Buck spat the straw from his mouth and rubbed his chin. "Lame a guess. Has something to do with you looking like a half-grown boy who lost a fight with a washtub full of laundry." She narrowed her eyes. "I need to hire a crew for a cattle drive." Buck's bushy brows lifted. "You planning on dressing like that the whole way?" "Yes." A beat of silence. Then Buck let out a wheezing laugh so loud a few of the nearby horses skittered in their pens. Evie scowled. "This isn't funny." "Darling," he gasped, wiping his eyes. "It's a damned sight funnier than anything I've seen all year." She planted her fists on her hips, glaring at him until he got control of his laughter. When he finally straightened, his face was serious, but there was still a spark of mischief in his eyes. "All right, I'll bite. Why, in the devil's name, are you planning to take 500 head of cattle across some of the roughest country in the territory, dressed as a man?" Evie took a breath. She'd expected him to question her, maybe even laugh her off outright, but this was Buck, a man who'd been by her father's side for more years than she'd been alive. He'd taught her how to ride, how to shoot, and how to rope steer before she was even out of pigtails. If anyone could understand why she had to do this, it was him. So she told him. She told him about the loan, about the Coltons, about Boone coming to survey the land, and she told him about the clause that could save Silver Creek, if they could pull off the cattle drive. When she finished, Buck let out a slow, considering whistle. "You got guts, girl," he said, shaking his head. "More than most men I know." She felt her chest tighten at his words, but she kept her expression carefully blank. "Will you help me?" Buck was quiet for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he sighed and pulled off his hat, scratching at his greying hair before jamming it back on his head. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Might as well. Ain't had a good adventure in a while." Relief washed over her like cool spring water. "You mean it?" Buck fixed her with a hard stare, all traces of humour gone. "Now listen close, Evie. If you go through with this, there ain't no turning back. If someone finds out you're a woman out on the trail, you won't just be laughed at, you'll be in real danger. You understand that?" She swallowed, but nodded. I understand. You sure? 'Cause the moment you step into that town to hire men, you ain't Miss Evie Chandler anymore. You're Evan. You gotta walk like a man, talk like a man. You gotta convince a crew of rough-ridden cowboys that you can hold your own. Her stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin. I can do it. Buck studied her for a long moment. Then, to her utter horror, he spat into his palm and held out his hand. You got yourself a partner, Evan Chandler. Evie made a sound halfway between a laugh and a gag, but she spat in her palm too and shook his hand. She would have preferred to seal the deal without the shared saliva, but it was a small price to pay for Buck's help. That afternoon they rode into Bent Willow, the closest town to Silver Creek, a dusty, sun-baked collection of wooden buildings with a saloon, general store, and blacksmith. Evie walked with deliberate strides, her hat pulled low, trying to mimic the way Buck moved. Easy, confident, with a little bit of a swagger. She practiced deepening her voice when she ordered supplies from the general store, nearly choked on her own spit, then finally got it right on the second try. They bought new boots, some properly fitting trail clothes, and a bedroll for the journey. Then came the hard part, finding a crew. Buck led her into the saloon where the best and worst kind of men gathered for work. Some were decent ranch hands down on their luck, some were drifters, and a few were just plain trouble. Evie took a steadying breath. If she was going to convince them she was Evan Chandler Wrangler, she needed to act like she belonged. So she strode in, boots heavy on the floorboards, sidled up to the bar and ordered a whiskey. She didn't drink whiskey, but Evan did, and as the burn of it nearly set her throat on fire, she managed to keep her face neutral. Buck smothered a smirk behind his own drink, and just like that the first test was passed. Tomorrow they'd start hiring men for the trail, but for now Evan was one step closer to saving Silver Creek, and he was damn well going to finish this whiskey. The sun hung high in the sky, baking the dirt yard of Silver Creek Ranch into a cracked, dusty canvas. Heat shimmered in the air, and a few flies buzzed lazily around Evie's face as she followed old Buck toward the storage shed behind the barn. "This is a terrible idea," Buck muttered, shaking his head as he rummaged through an old trunk. Evie crossed her arms over her chest, trying to ignore the way her brother's oversized boots threatened to trip her with every step. "It's the only idea we've got." Buck pulled out a warm pair of leather chaps and flung them over his arm before tossing a faded shirt and an old vest in her direction. "Well, if we're doing this, we're doing it right. Ain't no one going to believe you're a man walking around dressed like a woman in her brother's hand-me-downs." She scowled. "I look fine," Buck snorted. "You look like a broom handle wearing a pair of breeches 2 sizes too big." Evie had no response for that, because frankly he wasn't wrong. She stomped after him into the barn, where Buck tossed the clothes onto a hay bale and pulled a pair of shears from his belt. Her stomach clenched. "What are those for?" Buck lifted a brow. "That long braid of yours." Evie instinctively reached up, fingers grazing the thick plait she'd worn her whole life. Cutting it hadn't crossed her mind, and now that it had, she felt a sudden pang of loss. She hesitated. Buck sighed and leaned against a wooden post. "You keep it, and you might as well walk into Bent Willow with a sign round your neck saying, 'Not actually a man.'" She huffed out a breath. "Fine." He twirled the shears between his fingers. "You want to do it, or should I?" "Give me those," she grumbled, snatching them from his hand. She turned toward the small, dusty mirror nailed to the barn wall, hesitating only a second before hacking off the thick braid at the nape of her neck. The weight of it hit the ground with a soft thump. She stared at herself. The reflection looking back wasn't quite Evie Chandler anymore. Her newly shortened hair curled in loose waves around her ears, and with the right hat she could pass. Buck whistled low. "Now you're getting somewhere." Evie sighed. "What's next?" He handed her the binding cloth. 5 minutes later, after nearly suffocating herself trying to wrap it too tight, she stood in front of Buck, shirt tucked, vest fastened, and hat pulled low. Buck took a step back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I'll be damned. You're still ugly, but at least now you're believably ugly." She threw a horseshoe at his head. The small town of Bent Willow wasn't much. A dusty street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a livery, and the obligatory saloon. It was the saloon where they were headed. "Now remember," Buck muttered as they approached, "keep your head low, your voice deeper, and whatever you do, don't let 'em catch you looking too nervous. You gotta act like you belong." Evie squared her shoulders. "Good." Buck paused. "Oh, and don't order a lemonade." She shot him a look. "Maybe would I?" "Because you look like the kind of greenhorn that would." She glared. "Fine. I'll order whiskey." Buck snorted. "Even worse. If you sip it wrong, they'll know something's off." Evie felt like strangling him. Instead, she stomped through the saloon doors, hoping the sheer force of her bravado would do the trick. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale beer, cigar smoke, and unwashed cowboys. A few men sat hunched over their drinks at the bar, while others lingered around a card table, watching a poker game in progress. Evie swallowed hard and strode to the bar, careful to keep her shoulders squared like Buck had told her. The bartender, a burly man with a moustache the size of a possum, eyed her up and down. "What'll it be?" Evie opened her mouth. "Beer," Buck answered for her. The bartender shrugged and poured her a mug. Evie took it, grimacing at the warm foam, but forced herself to take a sip. It tasted like fermented horse piss, but she kept her face neutral. Buck looked proud. "All right," he murmured, leaning in slightly. "See that table by the stairs? That's where you start." Evie glanced over. 3 men sat there, 2 lean, dust-covered cowboys, and a barrel-chested man with a face like a bulldog. "He good?" she asked under her breath. Buck nodded. "Good enough, but you gotta sell yourself." Evie squared her shoulders, adjusted her hat, and made her way to the table. One of the men, the bulldog-faced one, barely spared her a glance before grunting around a cigar. "What do I want?" Evie cleared her throat, keeping her voice low and steady. "Looking for men to ride out on a cattle drive. Good pay, fair split." The man chewed the end of his cigar, his beady eyes squinting at her. "You running it?" Buck stepped up beside her. "He is," he said, voice firm, "and he's damn good at it." The other 2 cowboys exchanged looks. One leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "Where's the drive headed?" "Bent Willow to Silverton," Evie answered. The bulldog-faced man exhaled, sending a plume of smoke into the air. "Long ride. Lot of risks." "Lot of money," Buck countered. That caught their attention. Bulldog set his cigar aside, finally taking a real look at Evie. His squint deepened. "You ever done a drive before?" Evie didn't hesitate. "Plenty." Bulldog stared at her for a moment longer, then he grunted and spat into a nearby spittoon. "I'll ride," he said finally. Evie let out a slow breath, one down. The other 2 exchanged looks, then nodded. "Reckon we will too?" Evie barely stopped herself from sagging with relief. Buck clapped her on the back. "A little too hard. See, told you you'd do fine." Evie gave him a look that promised retribution later. "Meet at dawn," she told the men, adjusting her hat again. "Be ready for a long ride." They nodded. And just like that, the first piece of the plan was in place. As Evie and Buck left the saloon, the weight of what they'd done settled over her. They had a plan. They had a crew. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. But then, a tall figure on horseback rode into town. The sight of him made Evie freeze mid-step. Buck muttered a curse under his breath. Boone Colton had arrived, and he was looking straight at her. Chapter 2. Enter Boone Colton. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across Silver Creek Ranch, bathing the dry earth in a warm glow. In the distance, dark clouds rolled along the horizon, heavy with the promise of a coming storm. A stiff wind carried the scent of rain and horse sweat, kicking up dust along the dirt road leading to the main house. Evie stood near the corral, one boot propped on the lower rail, doing her best to look like she belonged there, like she'd spent years leaning casually against fences, spitting into the dirt and talking about cattle prices in a deep, manly voice. In reality, she was sweating. And not just from the heat. She tugged at the brim of her hat, grateful for the shadow it cast over her face. A few feet away, Buck stood beside her, arms crossed, chewing idly on a piece of straw as he observed the rider approaching in the distance. "You ain't gonna like this," Buck muttered. Evie didn't take her eyes off the tall, broad-shouldered figure steadily closing in. She already didn't like it. A single rider, dressed in dusty, trail-worn clothes, guided his stallion toward the ranch with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he had nowhere in particular to be, yet owned every piece of ground he set foot on. The way he sat in the saddle, relaxed but alert, like a man who had nothing to prove but would still have no trouble breaking bones if the situation called for it, made something twist in Evie's stomach. As the rider neared, she got a clearer look at him. Boone Colton. His reputation had preceded him, but seeing him in the flesh was an entirely different experience. He had the kind of rugged good looks that made women sigh and men wary. Dark, unruly hair, strong, angular jaw, and piercing grey-blue eyes that looked like they saw straight through a person's defences and into whatever secrets they were trying to keep. Evie squared her shoulders, silently commanding herself to stay calm, stay in character, and above all else, do not gape at the enemy. The enemy, however, was dismounting with a grace that made it clear he was no ordinary cowboy. Buck let out a slow whistle. "That's a man who don't make mistakes." Evie swallowed hard. "I don't plan to give him the chance." Boone Colton led his horse to the post, looping the reins over the rail before finally turning toward them. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Tall, broad, the kind of quiet, self-assured presence that made a man look like he'd already won the fight before it even started. His gaze flicked between Evie and Buck, assessing, calculating, deciding. Evie kept her hands loose at her sides, trying to mimic the way Buck stood. Casual but alert, the kind of stance that said, "I don't start trouble, but I damn sure finish it." Boone's lips curled slightly, not quite a smirk, but close enough to make her suspicious. He stepped forward, offering a polite nod. "Boone Colton." His voice was low, smooth, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "I take it one of you is running this outfit?" Evie's mouth went dry. Buck, the traitor, didn't jump in to answer. He just chewed his straw and waited. Evie cleared her throat, adjusted her stance, and did her best to deepen her voice without sounding like a boy trying too hard. "Yeah, that'd be me." Boone's gaze snapped to her, sharp and assessing. He took his time looking her over. Too much time, in Evie's opinion. She forced herself to hold his stare. Finally, he nodded. "You're the one taking Silver Creek's herd to Bent Willow?" "That's right." Boone studied her again, and Evie had the sinking feeling that he wasn't the kind of man who missed much. She did her best to look capable, as if she'd been leading cattle drives her whole life, instead of, say, pretending to be a man for all of 12 hours. "Evan Chandler," she said, sticking out a hand before she could think twice. Boone's brows lifted slightly, like he was surprised she'd offered, but he reached out and clasped her hand. Sweet Lord Almighty! His grip was firm, warm, calloused, just the right amount of rough to make her suddenly very aware that she was not, in fact, an actual man. Evie quickly pulled her hand back before she could do something foolish, like swoon. She squared her shoulders. "And you're here for—" Boone's lips twitched. "Ensuring fair play." Evie barely kept from rolling her eyes. "That what you call it?" Boone's grey-blue gaze held a flicker of amusement. "That's what my uncle calls it." Evie's jaw clenched at the mention of Luther Colton. Boone glanced at Buck, then back at her. "We heard you were hiring a crew." "We are." "How many men you got?" Evie didn't blink. "Enough." Boone folded his arms, biceps straining against the sleeves of his shirt, which... for the love of all things holy, was entirely unnecessary and distracting. He smirked. You don't have enough. Evie bristled. You don't know that? I do. Boone tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was some curious little puzzle he hadn't quite figured out yet. Evie fought the urge to fidget under his gaze. If you're here to tell me I can't do this, save your breath, she said flatly. Boone chuckled. I'm not here to stop you, Chandler. Just watch. The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. Not in fear, but in that prickling, wary way that told her this man was dangerous to more than just Silver Creek. He was dangerous to her secret, to her plan. And if she wasn't careful, to her heart. The wind shifted. It carried the sharp scent of coming rain, rattled the loose shingles on the barn, and sent the dry grass whispering in anticipation of the storm, rolling in from the west. And yet the real storm had already arrived. Evie, or Evan as far as Boone Colton was concerned, stood her ground, as Boone's assessing gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. She was unsettled by him, and she hated it. Boone Colton was the kind of man who didn't need words to command attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved like a predator who had no need to rush a kill, because he knew he'd get what he wanted in the end, and right now she was feeling an awful lot like prey. Buck, bless him, finally decided to step in. Well, he said, rocking back on his heels, we'd invite you inside, but seeing as how you're about as welcome as a rattlesnake in a bedroll, I figure you might not stay long. Boone turned his gaze toward Buck, and for a second Evie thought he might actually crack a smile. Mighty neighborly of you, Boone drawled. Guess I should be grateful you didn't meet me at the property line with a shotgun. I thought about it, Buck mused, but Evan here figured we'd at least let you get your boots dusty first. Boone glanced back at her. Evie had the overwhelming urge to fidget under his scrutiny, but she didn't. Men didn't fidget. At least, not the ones she was trying to imitate. Instead, she cleared her throat and crossed her arms in what she hoped was a rugged, masculine sort of way. You've seen the ranch. You know what we're up against. So unless you're here to offer us 100 head of cattle and a couple of hired guns, I'd say your job is done. Boone tilted his head slightly. Is that how you talk to everyone who rides onto your land? Just the ones who come to make sure we fail. He exhaled a slow breath through his nose, then turned and leaned against the corral fence, folding his arms in a way that only served to emphasize the muscles beneath his dust-covered shirt. Unnecessary. Completely unnecessary. Tell me about your crew, he said casually, like he wasn't peeling apart every word she spoke for weak spots in her armor. Evie felt her pulse stutter. Buck stepped in again, calm as ever. We've got some good hands lined up. Don't you worry about us. Not worried, Boone said. Just curious. Evie forced herself to adopt an easy stance, propping one boot on the lowest rail of the corral. Like this conversation was about as interesting as last year's newspaper. You'll see soon enough, she said. We leave in 3 days. Boone's sharp gaze flicked back to her. 3 days? Problem with that? Just seems ambitious for someone who doesn't have enough men. Buck snorted. You're mighty sure of yourself for a man who's just arrived. Boone shrugged. I've been running cattle since I was 15. I know a skeleton crew when I see one. Evie's jaw tightened. She'd spent her whole life working this land, pushing herself just as hard as any man, and she'd be damned if she let Boone Colton make her feel small. Then you all know, she shot back, matching his calm tone with one of her own, that numbers don't mean a thing if the crew ain't got grit. Boone studied her for a long moment. Too long. Then, to her complete and utter horror, he smiled. It wasn't much, just a slow, knowing twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. And worse, it was infuriatingly attractive. That's so, Boone mused. Well, I'll be right here to see if that's true. Evie stiffened. Meaning? Meaning, I'll be riding with you. Evie nearly choked on air. What? Boone pushed off the fence. "Uncle Luther wants me to ensure fair play, and I intend to do just that." Evie ground her back teeth together. "Of all the low-down, sneaky, conniving—" Buck exhaled, shaking his head. "Well, hell," Boone smiled again, wider this time, like he was enjoying the whole damn thing. "I'd say it'll be a pleasure riding with you, Evan," Boone said, tipping his hat, "but we both know that ain't true." And with that he turned, mounted his horse with a ridiculous amount of grace, and rode off toward the bunkhouse like he owned the place. Evie watched him go, arms crossed, cheeks burning hotter than the midday sun. She heard Buck chuckle beside her. "Well," he said, clapping her on the back, "you're in trouble now." Evie sighed through her nose. She was painfully aware. The wind kicked up hard and fast, rattling the barn's wooden walls and sending the scent of rain snaking through the air like a warning. Evie had barely had time to stew in her frustration over Boone's presence when the sky split open with a crack of thunder so loud that even the horses spooked in their stalls. A storm was coming, and so was Boone Colton. Evie heard the telltale rhythm of heavy bootsteps on the barn's dirt floor before she saw him. She'd recognize that confident, unhurried stride anywhere now, the kind of walk that said he was a man who never doubted himself, never second-guessed a thing in his life. Lucky him! She was currently second-guessing every decision she'd ever made, starting with this ridiculous plan and ending with whatever twist of fate had sent this man, this particular man, into her life like a stray bullet. A fresh gust of wind howled through the open barn doors, sending loose hay swirling into the air. The animals were nervous, shifting restlessly in their stalls, ears flicking at the rising tension in the atmosphere. Buck muttered a curse. "Storm's moving in fast." Boone stepped past her without a word and headed straight for the horses, running a firm hand down the flank of one particularly skittish gelding. Evie watched in reluctant admiration as the animal settled almost instantly under Boone's touch. It wasn't just the horses Boone had that effect on. There was something about him, a quiet steadiness, a self-assurance that made people listen when he spoke, trust when he moved, and for some reason that fact made her teeth grind. She yanked at the lead rope of a jittery mare and did her best to focus on her own job instead of the man currently making himself at home in her barn. "Storm like this rolls in, it's liable to spook the whole herd if they're left out," Boone said, his voice calm, practical. Evie didn't look at him. "We'll keep 'em penned for the night." Boone glanced toward the open doors where dark clouds had swallowed the last bit of daylight. "Better move fast, then." Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the barn in an eerie glow, before plunging them into dim, flickering lamplight again. Evie jumped. Boone did not. Of course he didn't. He looked like the kind of man who wouldn't flinch if the world split in half right in front of him. "Afraid of storms?" Boone asked, eyeing her. Evie bristled. No. His lips twitched, and she did not appreciate the amusement in his gaze. "I ain't," she added, just in case he needed clarification. Buck snorted. "Ain't fond of them neither." Evie shot Buck a glare that promised retribution before tightening the latch on one of the stall doors. "You know you don't have to be here." Boone adjusted his hat, giving her a slow, considering look that did something deeply irritating to her insides. "Guess I'm just neighborly that way." Lightning crashed again, closer this time, followed almost immediately by the deep roar of thunder. The entire barn shook with the force of it. Evie wasn't sure if it was her own nerves or something else entirely, but suddenly Boone Colton felt way too close, too big, too solid, too here. She turned back to the horses, focusing all her energy on not looking at him, not noticing the way he smelled like leather and rain, and something altogether aggravatingly masculine. "You got a problem with storms, Evan?" Boone asked, his voice smoother than it had any right to be. "I got a problem with strangers who show up out of nowhere and start giving orders," she shot back. Buck let out a low chuckle, but Boone didn't so much as blink. Instead, he just leaned a little closer, tipping his head slightly, as if he were studying her. "Always this prickly?" Evie's pulse jumped in an entirely unhelpful way. "Yes." Boone actually grinned at that. She did not like it. The wind howled again, shaking the doors on their hinges. Fat drops of rain pelted against the roof, and a sudden gust sent a loose strand of her hair whipping across her cheek. Before she could tuck it away, Boone's sharp gaze flicked toward her face. Something changed in his expression. Just for a second, a flicker of something. Evie's breath caught. Did he see it? Did he know? Her heart pounded so loud she was half convinced he could hear it. She forced herself to step back, to put space between them before her disguise unraveled right in front of his eyes. "Storm should pass by morning," Boone said finally, his tone unreadable. Evie swallowed hard. "Guess we'll see." A long silence stretched between them. Then Boone exhaled, shook his head, and gave her a look that was half amusement, half something else she couldn't quite name. "Well, Evan," he said, drawing out the name as if testing how it fit. "I got a feelin' this is going to be real interesting." Evie narrowed her eyes. "You ain't stayin'." "'Fraid I am." She froze. Boone leaned against a post, completely at ease, completely infuriating, and said, "I'll be riding out with you." Evie blinked. "You'll be what?" "You've heard me." Her stomach plummeted straight into her boots. Buck whistled under his breath. "Well, hell." Evie turned to him, panicked. "Do something." "What exactly would you like me to do?" Buck asked, smirking. Evie clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe through the sheer unrelenting agony of knowing she would now have to spend the next however many weeks on the trail with a man who could quite literally ruin everything with a single suspicious glance. Boone, of course, looked pleased as a cat with cream. "Looking forward to the trip, Evan," he said, tipping his hat before sauntering out into the storm. Evie watched him go, then turned to Buck. "You got any whiskey?" Buck chuckled. "You don't drink whiskey." "I do now." The first blush of dawn painted the sky in strokes of pink and orange, spilling soft light over the land like a gentle farewell. But there was nothing soft about this morning. The lowing of restless cattle, the creak of saddle leather, and the murmured voices of wranglers moving about in the early chill made the air hum with a tension Evie could feel in her bones. This was it. No turning back. Evie sat atop her horse, hands tight on the reins, willing herself to keep breathing evenly. Evan Chandler had to be calm. Evan Chandler had to look like he'd done this before. Problem was, Evie Chandler felt about 2 seconds away from throwing up. "Breathe, boy," Buck muttered beside her, amusement lacing his words. "Looking green round the gills ain't gonna help nobody." Evie shot him a lethal glare, but Buck wasn't wrong. The men were watching, including Boone, the irritatingly perceptive, always watching Boone. He sat astride his stallion a few feet away, studying the operation with a kind of cool detachment that made her insides knot. The man was entirely too relaxed for someone who wasn't supposed to be here. "You plan to actually help?" Evie called over, keeping her voice gruff and low. "Or just sit there looking pretty all day?" Buck choked on a laugh. Boone's grey-blue eyes gleamed as his gaze met hers. "Well, now," he said, "easy as you please. You noticed?" Evie nearly fell right out of her saddle. She opened her mouth. To say what, she wasn't sure, but one of the wranglers whistled, signalling the herd was ready, and Boone just tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode toward the cattle like he hadn't just stolen her ability to form coherent thoughts. An infuriating man. She shook it off, forced herself to focus. The drive was starting. The herd shifted uneasily, tails flicking, hooves stamping at the dirt. They knew something was happening, they could feel it, just like she could. Evie lifted her chin, steeling herself. "Let's move out," she called, and with that Silver Creek faded behind them. They rode in silence for the first hour, the rumbling of hooves the only sound as the cattle moved in a slow, dusty wave across the prairie. Evie kept her eyes ahead, resisting the urge to glance at Boone, who had, of course, placed himself right beside her, damn him. She knew what he was doing, watching, studying. A man like Boone Colton wasn't on this drive to be a silent observer. He was waiting for something. Sure enough, after a long pause, he spoke. "So, Evan," Boone said, voice casual, "where'd you work before this?" Evie's heart lurched against her ribs, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Out," she said, keeping her answer deliberately vague. "Drifted a bit," Boone hummed, clearly not satisfied. "Drifting's a hard way to make a living." Evie nodded. "Better than starving?" Boone's eyes flicked to hers. "That's so." She kept her gaze forward, focusing on the rolling hills in the distance. He let the silence stretch, like he was giving her time to tangle herself in her own story. She wasn't stupid enough to take the bait. Guess you picked up a thing or two, drifting like that," Boone mused. "Ranching skills, I mean." "Yeah. What's your best skill?" Evie blinked, feeling a flicker of alarm. "What?" "Your best skill." Boone's voice was smooth, calm. Too calm. "Wrangling? Breaking horses? Roping?" "Roping," she said quickly. Boone's lips twitched, like he was amused by something she didn't quite understand. "You sure?" Evie's mouth went dry. "Wouldn't I be sure?" Boone shrugged, deceptively casual. "Just wondering why Buck said you were a hell of a shot?" Evie barely stopped herself from visibly stiffening. Damn Buck. She shot the older man a look that promised bodily harm. Buck, the traitor, just grinned from his position ahead of them, completely unrepentant. Didn't think sharpshooters spent much time worrying about roping," Boone mused. Evie clenched her jaw. "I'm good at both." Boone didn't look convinced. She could practically hear the wheels turning in his head, and damn it all, he wasn't letting it go. "You're an interesting fella, Evan," Boone finally said, tilting his hat back. "Real interesting." Evie forced a casual shrug, but inside she was sweating bullets. "Because Boone Colton wasn't convinced?" "Not yet." But he was getting there. And that was a problem, a big one. The first streaks of dawn spilled over the rolling plains, turning the sky into a canvas of soft purples and pinks. The world was hushed, expectant, as if even nature itself knew something important was happening. Evie stood by her horse, tightening the cinch on her saddle, her fingers moving with quick, practiced efficiency. But her mind was miles away. This was it. By midday, Silver Creek would be nothing more than a dusty memory in the distance. And for the first time her father wouldn't be leading the charge. She felt him before she saw him, Jed Chandler's deliberate, uneven steps making their way across the packed dirt of the yard. The familiar tap of his cane against the ground sent something twisting inside her chest. She turned, and there he was, stubborn, grizzled, and far too pale in the early morning light. Jed Chandler had always been a force of nature, a man who never let the weight of the world settle on his shoulders, no matter how much it tried. But now his frame seemed smaller, his usual air of unshakable confidence dimmed by something Evie didn't want to name. Worry, regret, maybe even fear, and that was something she couldn't stand to see. She forced a grin and squared her shoulders. "You're up early," Jed snorted. "Like hell I was going to sleep with you stirring around out here all night and making a mess of my ranch." Evie rolled her eyes. "It ain't your ranch anymore, old man. It's mine." His expression softened just enough for pride to slip through the cracks of his tough exterior. "I suppose it is." That was the closest thing to a sentimental declaration her father had ever made. And for a split second, Evie wanted nothing more than to stay right where she was, to tell him she'd changed her mind, that she didn't need to prove herself, that she'd find another way. But then she looked past him, at the cattle shifting restlessly, at the men mounting up, at the open land stretching wide and uncharted ahead of them, and she knew she couldn't stay. Jed must have seen the battle raging in her eyes, because he let out a slow sigh. "You sure about this, girl?" The question was soft, uncharacteristically so. Evie swallowed, but her chin lifted. "I am." Jed studied her for a long moment. Too long. Then, with a quiet huff, He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw and shook his head. "Well, hell, ain't no stopping you once you've made up your mind." Buck, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, smirked. "She's got a stubborn streak worse than yours, Jed." Jed let out a damn truth. "Ain't that the damn truth?" He turned back to Evie, his eyes sharp, searching. "Oh, I need you to promise me something." Evie straightened, suddenly uneasy. "What?" Jed's gaze flicked to the cattle, then to the men waiting for her signal. "I need you to be careful," Evie huffed. "I'm always careful." Jed's jaw tightened. "No, you're not." Her stomach clenched. Because he was right. She wasn't. Not when it came to Silver Creek, not when it came to proving herself, and certainly not when it came to this reckless, ridiculous plan. Jed exhaled, his rough hand settling heavy on her shoulder. "It's not, Evie. Always have been. But don't let that smart mouth of yours get you into trouble you can't get out of." Something thick and tight lodged in her throat. She wanted to argue, to tell him she could handle herself, but she knew he wasn't asking because he doubted her. He was asking because he was afraid. And damn it all, she was too. Buck cleared his throat. "We ought to get moving if we want to make good time." Jed's eyes flicked to Boone, who had been lingering just far enough away to pretend he wasn't eavesdropping. His gaze narrowed. "And you're riding along?" Boone tipped his hat, that maddeningly unreadable expression firmly in place. "Looks that way." Jed didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he muttered, "Good." Evie's head snapped up, glaring at her father like he'd just told her he was handing over the ranch to Luther Colton himself. "Good," she repeated, aghast. Jed shrugged. "Man knows his way around a cattle drive." Evie turned to Buck for support, but the traitor was nodding along like this was the most reasonable thing he'd ever heard. Her anger bubbled up. "Y'all are acting like I need a damn babysitter." Jed's brows lifted. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Jed snorted. "Just saying, maybe having someone else looking out for you ain't the worst idea in the world." Evie scowled, but before she could argue, another whistle cut through the morning air. The cattle were restless, the men were ready, time was up. Jed stepped back, giving her one last long look. "You bring my girl home safe," he murmured just low enough for Buck and Boone to hear. Evie's stomach clenched. She didn't dare correct him. Instead, she swung up into the saddle, took one last breath of Silver Creek's morning air, and kicked her horse into motion. The herd stirred. The men followed. And just like that, they were gone. The land stretched wide before them, endless and uncertain. And somewhere in that uncertainty, Evie Chandler knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The sun was merciless. It had been 3 long, punishing days since they left Silver Creek, and the farther they travelled, the more the land turned against them. The once lush, rolling plains had given way to parched earth, cracked like an old saddle, the heat bearing down so hard it felt like a branding iron on their backs. Evie's shirt was soaked through, her hat damp with sweat, and the smell of hot cattle, dust, and unwashed cowboys had settled over the trail like a bad omen. The herd moved sluggishly, their low, tired bawls echoing in the heat, and if they didn't find water soon, they were in trouble, real trouble. The men knew it, and unfortunately so did Boone Colton. Evie adjusted her hat and guided her horse up beside Buck, who sat slumped in his saddle, fanning himself with his hat. "You seen anything?" she asked, her voice dry as the dust caking her throat. Buck shook his head. "Nothing. If we don't find water soon, we're going to have a bunch of dead cattle and some mighty pissed-off cowboys." Evie gritted her teeth. They couldn't afford to lose stock. She turned, scanning the horizon, trying to ignore the way Boone Colton rode beside the herd like he belonged there, like he wasn't some unwelcome thorn in her side. As if sensing her glare, Boone lifted his head and met her gaze with maddening ease. "You're looking awful desperate up there, Chandler," he called, smirking, just enough to make her fingers itch for a rock to throw at his head. Evie scowled. "You got something useful to say, or just more pretty words?" Boone nudged his horse forward, coming to ride alongside her with that effortless, irritating confidence of his. "I know where there's water." Evie nearly fell off her horse. She blinked. "You what?" Boone stretched lazily, as if he wasn't currently holding the solution to their biggest problem like it was a piece of gossip he'd been waiting for the right moment to spill. "There's a spring about 3 miles west," he said, "fed by an underground river. Ain't dried up yet." Buck, who had been listening, sat up straight. "You sure?" Boone looked almost offended. "You calling me a liar, old man? Wouldn't be the first time," Buck muttered. Boone smirked. "Well, you're in luck this time. I'm telling the truth." Evie narrowed her eyes. "And you didn't mention this sooner because—" Boone gave her a slow, lazy shrug, the kind that suggested he was enjoying himself entirely too much. "You seemed real set on doing this your way. Thought I'd let you stew a little." Evie clenched her jaw so hard her teeth ached. There was a very real possibility that she was about to commit homicide right there on the trail. Buck, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat. "Well, hell, boy, lead the way before we all dry up like old jerky." Boone winked at Evie. Actually winked at her, before turning his horse and leading them west. And if Evie's death glare could have set a man on fire, Boone Colton would have been nothing but a pile of ashes. They reached the spring just as Evie was preparing to send Boone to an early grave. And she hated to admit it. She really, truly hated to admit it, but the man had been right. The spring was there, tucked beneath a rock outcropping, surrounded by scrub brush and tall, stubborn trees that had no business surviving in this heat. Water trickled in a clear, blessed stream, and before Evie could even fully process it, the cattle surged forward, pushing toward the water in desperate, relieved growth. The men weren't far behind. Evie sat back in her saddle, watching as the herd drank deep, as wranglers splashed water on their sunburned faces, as Buck muttered something about how he'd have kissed Boone square on the mouth if he weren't such a damn nuisance. Evie didn't even have the energy to argue. Her body relaxed for the first time in days. They'd be okay. For now. Boone rode up beside her, his expression unreadable. "Rolled you?" Evie exhaled slowly. "Don't start." Boone's lips quirked up at the corners, like he was trying real hard not to gloat, but failing miserably. "You going to admit I saved your ass?" Evie turned to face him, deadpan. "If it means you'll shut up about it, then sure. Thanks for saving my ass, Boone Colton." Boone let out a deep, rumbling chuckle, and for the first time Evie noticed that it was a nice sound. Warm, rich, the kind of sound that could curl around a person like a blanket on a cold night. Not that she cared. At all. "Really? I'll take it," he said, tipping his hat before riding off toward the spring. Evie watched him go, annoyed that he wasn't as annoying as she wanted him to be. Buck rode up beside her, still dripping wet from dunking his entire head in the spring. "Well," he said, shaking the water out of his beard like a dog, "that was unexpected." Evie sighed. "You mean Boone being useful instead of just an overgrown thorn in my side?" Buck smirked. "I meant you thanking him without choking on it." Evie rolled her eyes so hard she saw her own past mistakes. "Don't get used to it," Buck chuckled. "Oh, I won't, but I sure am enjoying it while it lasts." Evie sighed, watching Boone joke with a couple of the wranglers, watching the way the men who had once been skeptical of him now nodded their appreciation. Boone Colton wasn't just a nuisance, he was a damn problem. And she had a sneaking suspicion he wasn't done surprising her yet. The prairie was quiet, too quiet. Evie sat on her horse at the edge of camp, watching the cattle shift in the moonlight, their massive forms barely visible in the shadows. The only sounds were the occasional low grumble of restless steers, the soft creak of leather as the men settled into their bedrolls, and the distant wail of a coyote. Something was off. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it. A prickling awareness at the back of her neck, like the land itself was holding its breath. She wasn't the only one who sensed it. Boone, sitting a few feet away, shifted in his saddle and exhaled slowly, his silhouette cut sharp against the dark horizon. "You feel that?" he muttered. Evie nodded. "Yeah." Buck, leaning against a nearby fence post, snorted. "You two sound like a couple of old women worrying about bad omens." Evie shot him a glare. Something don't sit right." Boone's hand rested on his reins, fingers loose but ready. "Cattle are uneasy. They've been twitchy since sundown." Evie's pulse kicked up a notch. Cattle didn't spook for no reason, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that an uneasy herd was a dangerous herd. Then the sky exploded. A crack of thunder split the night in two, shaking the ground beneath them. The air boomed so loud Evie felt it in her chest, like the earth itself had taken a deep, violent breath. And then everything went to hell. The herd erupted. The first ball of panic cut through the night, and before Evie could do anything but suck in a sharp breath, the ground beneath them came alive with the thunder of hooves. Cattle, hundreds of them, broke into a blind, frenzied stampede, their massive bodies colliding, kicking up dirt and chaos. "Damn it!" Boone spurred forward before Evie could even think, galloping straight toward the madness. She yanked at her reins, digging her heels into her horse's sides, and took off after him. Buck's shouted warnings disappeared beneath the deafening roar of hooves. The world turned into a blur of dust and motion. The stampede surged like a river let loose, cattle barreling forward in a blind panic. If they didn't stop them soon, they'd lose the whole herd. Or worse, ride straight into a ravine and lose lives along with them. Evie's heart slammed against her ribs as she wove her horse through the dark mass of bodies. "Damn them, Boone!" roared over the chaos. Evie knew what she had to do. She grabbed her rifle from its scabbard, took one deep breath, and fired into the air. The sharp crack of gunfire cut through the night, a loud, jarring sound that made the nearest cattle veer off course. She fired again, and then again. The stampede began to curve, turning into itself in a wide, stumbling arc. One by one, the wranglers joined in, waving torches, hollering, anything to push the cattle off their destructive path. It worked. Slowly the herd began to slow, their fear shifting into confusion, until, finally, the stampede collapsed into a clumsy, scattered cluster of panting, shaken animals. Silence rang in the aftermath. Evie's pulse still pounded, her throat burned with dust. And Boone was staring at her. Evie exhaled, shaking out her trembling hands. Boone sat completely still, his horse shifting beneath him as if it too could feel the tension suddenly hanging between them. "You all right?" His voice was low, measured. Evie nodded. "Fine." Boone's gaze flicked down to where her shirt had come slightly loose in the madness. Evie's stomach dropped. The binding beneath her clothes had slipped, just enough that the shape of her chest wasn't as flat as it should have been. Boone's eyes darkened. Evie's throat went dry. The wind kicked up dust between them. Boone tilted his head slightly like he was putting together a puzzle. For one long, agonizing moment she swore he knew. Then he blinked, shook his head slightly, and exhaled. "Nice shootin'," he muttered. Evie let out a slow, careful breath. "Thanks." Boone hesitated. Just a beat too long, before turning his horse toward the recovering herd. Evie sat frozen, heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know how much he'd seen, but she knew one thing for sure. Boone Colton was watching her. And that? That was a problem, a big one. The fire burned low and steady, casting flickering shadows across the weary faces of the men sprawled around it. The smell of charred beans, sweat, and damp earth mixed in the night air, heavy with the lingering aftermath of the stampede. Evie sat with her back against a log, her body sore from head to toe, watching as the men nursed their bruises and egos. Someone grumbled about nearly getting trampled to death, someone else cursed at the hole in his boot, and Buck, ever the optimist, simply muttered, "Well, hell, that could have been worse." Evie wasn't so sure. She'd never seen a herd turn that fast, never felt the earth quake beneath her the way it had tonight. and the fact that they'd all come out of it in one piece felt a little too lucky. Across the fire, Boone Colton sat quietly, watching her. His sharp, knowing gaze hadn't left her since the stampede ended, and it was starting to make her skin itch. She could tell he had questions, ones she wasn't prepared to answer. But she also knew that Boone Colton wasn't the type of man to let a thing go once he'd gotten a hold of it. And that was a problem. The men slowly started peeling off, one by one, bedrolls unfurling, muttered goodnights drifting into the cool air. Eventually, only Boone and Evie remained by the fire. Evie stretched her legs out in front of her, hissing as pain shot through her muscles. Boone smirked. "Or, nope," she lied, wincing. Boone snorted, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, watching the flames dance. "That could have gone real bad," he murmured. Evie exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the occasional snort of a horse, the distant call of an owl in the darkness. Evie cleared her throat. "You ever seen a stampede like that?" Boone nodded, his expression unreadable. "Once. Lost a damn good man." Something cold settled in her stomach. "I'm sorry?" Boone glanced at her, as if surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment she thought he might brush it off, make some joke about how life on the trail wasn't for the weak, but instead he just nodded. "Sometimes, no matter how careful you are," he murmured, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "The land don't give a damn." Evie studied him, realizing that beneath all that confidence and smirking bravado there was something else. Something he didn't let most people see. She didn't know why, but it made her chest feel tight. She looked back at the fire, poking at a stray ember with the toe of her boot. "Guess that's why you don't flinch at much," she said. Boone chuckled, low and rough. "That, and I got real good at pretending." Evie found herself smiling, though she wasn't sure why. "Same," she murmured before she could think better of it. Boone looked over at her then. Really looked, and for a split second she felt exposed, like maybe, just maybe, he was seeing more than she meant for him to see. But before either of them could say another word, a gust of wind sent the fire flickering, snapping them both back into the moment. Boone exhaled and pushed to his feet, dusting off his hat. "We should get some sleep," he said, his voice back to its usual unreadable tone. Evie nodded, still feeling off balance. "Yeah." He hesitated, just for a second, before tipping his hat at her and walking toward his bedroll. Evie watched him go, her stomach twisting in ways she didn't have the patience to unpack, because something had shifted tonight. Something small, but something. And that was dangerous. Because Boone Colton wasn't supposed to be a man she liked, and yet, as she lay back against the hard ground, staring up at the star-flecked sky, she knew one thing for certain. He was becoming real damn hard to ignore. Chapter 3. Rustlers and Revelation. The morning air was cool and still, the kind of hush that sat too heavy, too expectant. The canyon walls loomed on either side, their jagged silhouettes catching the first blush of dawn, turning the rocks into golden rust. Evie didn't like it. Not one bit. The herd had settled for the night, the cattle huddled close together, chewing lazily, their heavy bodies pressed against the early chill. The men were in various states of wakefulness, some still curled in their bedrolls, others rubbing the sleep from their eyes as they moved about camp, rekindling the fire, or stretching out the kinks from another night on hard ground. It was too peaceful, which meant trouble was coming. Evie had spent enough years on this land to know when something felt wrong, and this morning something felt real damn wrong. She shifted in her saddle, scanning the canyon's edge, where the rocky cliffs cast long, ominous shadows over the narrow trail. Buck, standing beside his horse, let out a deep sigh. "You got that look again." Evie shot him a side-eye glare. Look. "The one that says you're about to do something stupid." She huffed. "I don't—" Crack! The sharp, unmistakable sound of a rifle shot split the air, followed by the sharp bawl of a panicked steer. Then chaos. Gunfire erupted from the canyon's edge, and suddenly men in dust-covered coats came charging down the slopes, guns drawn, spurring their horses hard toward the camp. "Rustlers!" Boone's voice boomed through the confusion, already grabbing his rifle as he swung on to his horse. Evie's blood shot cold. The cattle panicked, their sleepy movements turning into frenzied chaos as steers stumbled, bucked, and broke into a terrified run. One of the rustlers whooped as he fired into the air, herding a section of the cattle toward an escape route. Not on my watch, Evie didn't think. She reacted. She yanked her rifle from its scabbard, lifted it with smooth, practiced ease, and fired. Crack! The lead rustler jerked in his saddle, his hat flying off as he went down. The other outlaws yanked their reins, suddenly not quite so eager. But they weren't gone yet. More shots rang out, dust kicking up around the stampeding cattle, the whole herd threatening to turn into another runaway disaster. Evie barely had time to register Boone riding up beside her, his revolver blazing, his expression tight with focus. "We gotta turn 'em or we lose the whole damn herd," he barked. Evie didn't argue. Instead, she wheeled her horse around, gritted her teeth, and rode straight into the chaos. She barely felt the burn in her arms as she lifted her rifle again, barely registered the yells of the men around her as she took another clean shot, sending another rustler crashing into the dust. The rest of them must have decided it wasn't worth the trouble, because one by one they yanked their horses around, kicking up dust as they fled. A few shots followed them, but the fight was over. Evie let out a long breath, her pulse hammering in her ears as she scanned the canyon's edge. Nothing moved. They were gone. For now. The cattle, though shaken, had mostly stilled, their skittish bawling settling into uneasy quiet. Evie exhaled sharply, then realized Boone was staring at her. She turned her head, and sure enough, Boone sat motionless in his saddle, watching her. Not just watching, studying, as if he were trying to figure out a puzzle, and she was the last missing piece. "What?" she snapped, trying to sound gruff, irritated, anything but nervous. Boone's grey-blue gaze flicked to her rifle, then back to her. "You're real good with that gun, Evan." Evie's stomach tightened. Too good. She knew it, and so did Boone. She forced a casual shrug. "Lucky shots." Boone tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing like he didn't quite believe her. Then, in the flickering dawn light, something changed. His expression shifted. Just barely, but enough. Enough for Evie to know that he saw something he shouldn't have. A slip, a mistake. Something in the way she moved, the way she held herself, maybe even the pitch of her voice when she shouted orders. Boone saw it, and Boone wasn't a stupid man. His lips parted, like he was about to say something, but Buck, completely oblivious to the tension, stomped over, yanking his hat off his head. "Well, hell," Buck muttered, spitting into the dirt. That was one way to wake up. Evie nearly sank into the earth with relief. Boone closed his mouth, his gaze flicking away for a fraction of a second. The moment was gone, but not forgotten. Evie knew that, and worse. So did Boone. As the men moved to round up the scattered cattle and check for injuries, Evie busied herself with her saddle, anything to avoid Boone's eyes. But she could feel him watching her, and she knew, without a doubt, that Boone Colton wasn't letting this go. Not now, not ever. Because Boone Colton had just discovered something he wasn't meant to, and Evie had just run out of time. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of sweat and dust as the camp regrouped after the attack. The rustlers were gone, for now, but their presence lingered in the rattled nerves of the cattle and the weary tension in the men's faces. Evie was trying real hard not to let her own nerves show, or her pain. She gritted her teeth, refusing to look down at the thin line of blood soaking through the sleeve of her shirt. The bullet had only grazed her. Nothing life-threatening, but the sting was sharp, pulsing with every movement. She just needed to ignore it, bandage it herself, and move on. Except, "You're bleeding." Evie stiffened at the deep, quiet voice behind her. Boone. Of course, because Boone Colton was always there, always watching, always too damn perceptive for his own good. "It's nothing," she muttered, turning slightly to shield her arm from his view. Boone wasn't buying it. Before she could blink, he reached out, caught her wrist, and turned her gently but firmly toward him. Evie's stomach flipped, because suddenly he was too close, too big, too solid, too dangerous in a way she wasn't prepared for. "You got yourself shot," he said, his voice low but oddly gentle, as if he hadn't just been firing off rounds like a man possessed minutes ago. Evie swallowed. "It's a graze." Boone lifted a skeptical brow. "Let me see." "I can handle it." Boone ignored her, because of course he did. The next thing she knew, he was unbuttoning his saddlebag, pulling out a small tin of something medicinal-looking, and grabbing a strip of cloth. Evie tensed. "I told you, it's fine." "Shut up and sit down," Boone said, without an ounce of apology. Evie bristled, but before she could tell him exactly what she thought about his tone, Buck let out a low chuckle from across the fire. "Might as well let him, Evan. Boone's about as stubborn as a mule with its tail caught in a fence." Boone smirked. "I'm glad you noticed." Evie grumbled a curse and reluctantly sat on a nearby log, clutching her injured arm against her chest like a sulking child. Boone knelt beside her, and suddenly everything felt a whole lot more dangerous. Boone's hands were surprisingly gentle as he carefully rolled up her sleeve, exposing the small but angry-looking gash beneath. Evie bit the inside of her cheek, not because of the pain, but because Boone Colton's fingers were currently skimming over her skin, and she was having a real hard time pretending she didn't notice. Or, worse, that she didn't like it. "You're lucky," Boone murmured, his voice strangely quiet as he dipped the cloth into his canteen and began dabbing at the wound. Evie hissed through her teeth. Boone glanced up, his grey-blue gaze locking onto hers. "That bad?" "No," she said a little too quickly. Boone narrowed his eyes slightly, like he was trying to figure her out, like he already knew something wasn't adding up, and Lord help her, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up this charade, because Boone Colton wasn't just seeing her, he was really seeing her, and that was terrifying. He dipped his head slightly, concentrating as he worked, and Evie swore she could feel the heat radiating off of him. This was too much, too close, too careful. She could almost see the moment he noticed her frame was smaller than it should be, the way his fingers lingered just a second too long, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Evie held her breath. Boone looked up. For a split second, the world stilled. His gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his expression. And then he smirked. "That bad, huh?" he said, breaking the moment before it could spiral into something worse. Evie exhaled sharply, forcing herself to relax. Damn him. Damn Boone Colton and his sharp eyes and his hands that felt way too steady on her skin. She yanked her arm back before she did something real stupid, like, "Enjoy this." Boone leaned back on his heels, watching her again, and Evie had the sinking feeling that Boone Colton was putting the pieces together, slowly, steadily, and when he finally figured it out, she was done for. That night, Evie couldn't sleep. She lay in her bedroll, staring up at the endless stretch of stars, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts she didn't want to be having. Because Boone had been gentle, because Boone had been careful, because Boone had touched her in a way no man ever had before, and she hadn't hated it. Not even a little. And that was a real big problem, because Boone wasn't just any man, he was a Colton. He was Luther Colton's nephew, and he was the enemy, wasn't he? Evie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to silence the war raging in her chest. But no matter how hard she tried, one truth kept nagging at her. Boone Colton wasn't the villain she'd made him out to be, and worse, she wasn't so sure she wanted to keep fighting him anymore. The dusty frontier outpost sat at the edge of a dry creek bed, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings leaning into the wind like tired old men. A mercantile, a smithy, a saloon that had definitely seen better days. It wasn't much, but after days on the trail, it felt like a blessing. The cattle were penned outside town, their tired lowing mingling with the occasional bark of a dog and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The men, eager for a break, had already started peeling off toward the saloon, grinning at the prospect of whiskey and warm company. Evie, however, had other plans. She dismounted quickly, pulling her hat lower as she grabbed the supply list from her saddlebag. If she played this right, she could be in and out of the mercantile before anyone got the bright idea to invite her for a drink. Unfortunately, Boone Colton was standing right there, watching her like a fox watching a henhouse. She didn't have to look at him to know he was smirking. "Not staying for a drink?" Boone asked lazily, crossing his arms as he leaned against the hitching post. Evie gritted her teeth. "Nope." Boone lifted a brow. "You sure? You seem like the quiet type, but a few shots of whiskey might loosen you up." Her fingers twitched. If she weren't trying so hard to maintain her disguise, she'd have shoved his smug face right into the watering trough. Just getting supplies," she muttered, pushing past him toward the mercantile. Boone fell into step beside her. Of course he did. The inside of the mercantile smelled like dry goods, leather, and kerosene. It was a small place, shelves stocked with sacks of flour, jars of preserves, and bolts of fabric for the occasional rancher's wife who wandered through. Evie focused on her list, ticking off items as she went. Salt, coffee, hardtack. Meanwhile, Boone was studying her. She could feel it. His gaze lingering, thoughtful, waiting. Finally he spoke. "You're awful jumpy, Evan." Evie stilled, her hand tightening around the jar of beans she'd just picked up. "No, I ain't." Boone tilted his head, voice lazy but sharp. "You sure about that? 'Cause you ride into town like a man with a bounty on his head, won't step foot in the saloon, and damn near flinched when a pretty little shop girl smiled at you." Evie did not flinch. She did, however, resist the urge to throw the beans at his head. She turned slowly, giving him her best unimpressed stare. "You're always this nosy," Boone smirked. "Only when something don't add up." Evie's pulse kicked up a notch, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I just ain't much for drinking," she muttered, returning to her list. Boone hummed, "That's all." Evie nodded. Boone took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Then tell me, Evan, what exactly are you much for?" Evie's stomach dropped, because suddenly the teasing edge in his voice was gone. This wasn't Boone being a pain in the ass. This was Boone Colton digging for the truth. Evie grabbed a sack of flour, hiding her panic behind busyness. "And much for finishing this damn shopping," she muttered, shouldering past him toward the counter. She heard Boone chuckle behind her, deep and low, and if she wasn't mistaken, there was something almost amused in it. Like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to figure things out. Evie stepped out of the mercantile, adjusting the weight of the supplies over her shoulder, her nerves still rattled from the exchange. Boone followed at a leisurely pace, looking completely at ease. "You're real good at avoiding questions," he commented, matching her stride. She huffed. "And you're real good at asking too many." Boone chuckled. "What can I say? I got a knack for spotting things that don't quite fit." Evie's fingers clenched around the strap of the saddlebag. Damn him. Damn his watchful eyes and sharp mind and stupid, irritating smirk. She could feel herself cracking. And the worst part? Boone knew it. "Amy, do you care so much, Colton?" she snapped, turning to glare at him. Boone didn't blink. Instead he took a step closer, his gaze steady. "Maybe I just like a good mystery." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Evie's heart pounded, a wild, uneven rhythm she didn't have the time to untangle. Boone was onto her. She could see it in his eyes. That flicker of certainty, like he'd put together just enough of the puzzle to know there was more to find. The only question was how long until he figured out the rest. The town sat quiet in the late afternoon sun, dust swirling lazily in the warm breeze, the scent of horses, sweat, and something fry lingering in the air. It wasn't much, A one-reed frontier settlement with a handful of buildings, all rough-hewn wood and necessity, nothing fancy. It should have been a place of respite. But Evie, she was about 2 seconds away from coming completely undone. Boone had been watching her ever since they arrived. Not the way a man watched a rival, but the way a man putting a puzzle together watched for that final damning piece. And she had the sinking suspicion that she was that piece. So she did what any self-respecting woman disguised as a man trying not to get caught in a frontier town would do. She avoided him like the damn plague. Unfortunately, Boone Colton was a very persistent man, which is how she found herself pinned between the side of the general store and Boone's very broad, very solid body, staring up at the only man she absolutely did not need seeing through her right now. "You got something to tell me, Evan?" Boone's voice was low, smooth, but there was steel beneath it. Evie swallowed hard, trying real hard to focus on being annoyed instead of completely panicked. "You always this fond of cornering men behind buildings?" she gritted out, doing her best to sound gruff and unimpressed. Boone's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "Only when they're hiding something. Damn him." Evie tilted her chin up, crossing her arms over her chest. Not too tight, though, lest she remind him of certain anatomical features she was very much trying to hide. "I ain't hiding nothing," Boone exhaled, shaking his head. "That's so." His gaze dragged over her. "Too slow, too calculating." "You don't drink?" he mused. "You keep your distance from the men, avoid bathhouses and bunkhouses. You ride as good as any wrangler I've met, but you don't talk like one." Evie kept her jaw locked, even as something cold trickled down her spine. Boone leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "And you flinch," he murmured. Evie went completely still. Boone's gaze flicked to hers, sharp as a blade. "Back at the Mercantile, when that saloon girl touched your shoulder, you jerked away like she'd burned you." Evie's heart pounded so hard she swore he could hear it. Boone studied her, his eyes unreadable now. "I don't know what you're running from," he murmured, "but if you're hiding something dangerous, you better tell me now." Evie clenched her fists. He was too close, too big, too steady, too Boone. And worst of all, he didn't sound accusatory, he sounded worried, which was worse. Because Evie could handle Boone being a suspicious bastard. She could handle his smirks, his sharp words, his constant poking at the edges of her disguise. What she couldn't handle was the idea that maybe, just maybe, he cared. She swallowed hard. "I ain't got nothing to tell you, Colton." Boone's jaw ticked. For a long moment he just watched her. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, giving her just enough space to breathe properly again. "All right," he muttered. "But if you're lying, Evan, if you get yourself killed because of it—" His gaze locked onto hers, something dark flickering there. "I ain't going to be the one digging your grave." And with that, he turned and walked away. Evie let out a slow, shaky breath. She didn't watch him go, but she could still feel him, just the same. Later that night, Boone stood outside the telegraph office, staring down at the folded piece of paper in his hand. The words blurred together in the dim lantern light, but he didn't need to read them again. The message was clear. "Ensure the Chandler Drive fails." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a damn order. Boone exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. Luther Colton had never been a patient man, and he wasn't in the habit of giving Boone jobs he didn't expect him to finish. And yet, Boone's eyes lifted toward the camp, where the men were settling in, where the herd rested for another long day ahead, where Evan Chandler sat near the fire, rubbing at her injured arm. Boone's stomach tightened, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure he wanted to do what his uncle asked. And that was a problem. A big one. Because Boone Colton wasn't a man who ignored orders. But now he wasn't so sure he could follow them. The trail stretched ahead, dry and endless, the kind of land that had a way of testing a person. physically, mentally, and sometimes in ways they didn't see coming. Evie was feeling every single test. She sat stiff in the saddle, dust caking her skin, hat pulled low against the relentless sun. The herd had been restless all morning, their lowing more frequent, their movements more jittery than usual. And Boone? He hadn't said a word to her all day, which was somehow worse than him pestering her. He'd been distant, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon, his jaw set in a way that told her he had something on his mind. Something that probably wasn't good. And sure enough, it wasn't, because not an hour later the silence of the trail was shattered by the crack of gunfire. The first shot sent the cattle surging forward, hooves kicking up a dust storm as frightened bawls filled the air. Evie barely had time to yank at her reins before chaos erupted. A group of armed riders tore over the ridge, their faces half covered in dust-stained bandanas, guns raised as they fired into the air. Not aiming to kill, but to scatter. Luther Colton's men. Evie felt her stomach drop. Buck was already shouting orders, wranglers cursing as they tried to regain control of the panicked herd. Evie spurred her horse forward, but before she could get far, her gaze locked onto Boone. He sat there, motionless on his horse, watching. Not stopping it, not helping, just watching. And Evie realized, with a sickening twist in her gut, he'd known this was coming. "Boone!" she shouted over the chaos. His head snapped toward her, eyes unreadable, his grip tight on the reins. For a split second something flickered across his face. Something torn, uncertain. Evie didn't have time to wait. She dug her heels into her horse's sides, charged forward into the stampede, and grabbed her rifle. One of the hired guns, a wiry-looking bastard with a cruel grin, was about to fire another shot. Evie didn't hesitate. She lifted her rifle, aimed, and pulled the trigger. Crack! The man's hat went flying as he yelped, his horse stumbling sideways beneath him. The others turned, startled. Evie swung her rifle toward them next. "Get the hell off my land!" she bellowed, and to her surprise, they hesitated, because she was standing her ground and she wasn't backing down. But it wasn't just the rustlers watching her now. Boone was, too, and something shifted in his expression, something sharp and dangerous and filled with realization. Evie didn't have time to dwell on it, because at that moment one of the rustlers reached for her, and Boone moved, fast, faster than she'd ever seen. His gun was out and fired before she could even react. The rustler shouted, clutching his arm as he wheeled his horse around. The others took one look at Boone, at the man they'd clearly assumed was on their side, and suddenly they weren't so sure. And then they ran. The dust settled, the gunfire fading into the distance. But Evie, she was still reeling. Boone turned toward her, still on his horse, his face unreadable, his revolver lowered but still in hand. He exhaled, then dismounted, his boots crunching against the dirt as he stepped toward her. Evie didn't move, couldn't, because suddenly he was too close, too knowing, too Boone. His gaze raked over her, and she could feel it, the weight of realization sinking in, the way all the things that hadn't made sense before were suddenly clicking into place. Evie's pulse hammered in her throat. Boone exhaled. "Son of a bitch," he murmured. Then, before she could stop him, before she could even think, his hand shot out, grabbing her hat and yanking it off. Evie's hair tumbled free. The world stood still. For a long, heavy moment, nobody spoke. Then Boone, who never looked rattled, who always had a smug response ready, just stood there, staring at her, like she was a ghost or a miracle or the biggest damn fool he'd ever met. Evie swallowed hard, her fingers twitching at her sides. Boone blinked. Then he let out a rough, almost breathless laugh. "Well, hell!" Evie closed her eyes. Because now she was really in trouble. The land stretched wide and open, but the air was thick, too thick, with something Evie couldn't name. Dusk swirled in the wake of the stampeding cattle, the sharp scent of gunpowder and sweat lingering in the aftermath of the attack. The rustlers had fled, but their damage was done. The herd had been spooked to hell and back, and the men were on edge. And Boone was staring at her like he'd just seen a ghost. Evie's pulse pounded, every part of her body screaming, "Move, do something, say something." But before she could, one of the remaining rustlers lunged at her. And everything shattered. Evie saw the movement too late. The man's dirty hand grabbing her collar, yanking her forward so hard she nearly lost her footing. A hat went flying. Her breath hitched as rough fingers clawed at her shirt, yanking hard. Too hard. And suddenly the cloth tore, the wind ripped through the exposed skin of her chest, and before she could stop it, before she could do anything, the truth was there, plain as day, bound beneath the wrappings, hidden for weeks, but not hidden any more. For a long, terrible second, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that hollowed out a person's chest. Then, "Son of a—" The curse came from one of the wranglers, followed by the sharp intake of breath from another. The rustler stumbled back, blinking like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And Boone looked like he'd been hit by a runaway horse. Evie yanked her shirt closed, her hands shaking like never before. But it was too late. They knew. They all knew. She could feel it. The weight of their stares pressing in. Confusion shifting into realization. Realization into something else. Something dangerous. Buck was the first to speak. "Well, I'll be damned!" His voice wasn't angry exactly, more stunned, like the air had been knocked clean out of him. One of the younger wranglers, Danny, took a full step back, eyes wide. You're every—" "Yes," Evie bit out, her voice hoarse. She refused to shrink, even as her heart slammed against her ribs. She'd known this moment would come. She just hadn't expected it to happen like this. Buck let out a low whistle, rubbing his jaw. "Well, hell, Evie, I got to admit, I didn't see that coming." Danny was still gaping, the rest of the crew shifting on their feet, looking at one another as if waiting for someone to say the right thing. And Boone hadn't moved. He just stood there, staring at her, his jaw tight, his expression something she couldn't quite read, but his eyes— And that was the part that scared her the most. Evie swallowed hard. Then, before anyone else could say something she wasn't ready to hear, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I know what y'all are thinking." Her voice came out stronger than she felt, steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I lied to you," she admitted, lifting her chin. "I lied because I had to, because if I hadn't, we wouldn't be standing here right now. The ranch would already be gone." Silence. Then, a low murmur from the crew. "I fought just as hard as any of you," she pressed on, her voice unwavering, her hands clenched into tight fists. "And I ain't about to let Luther Colton steal what's mine." She looked at every single one of them, daring them to challenge her. "Now you can ride out," she continued, "or you can stand with me." Her pulse pounded. 1 second, 2, then Buck snorted. "Hell, girl," he muttered. "You had me fooled good, but I can't say I'm surprised. Stubborn as you are, you'd have done this with or without the disguise." A few of the other men chuckled uneasily, the tension breaking just a little. Danny still looked flustered, but he rubbed at his neck and grumbled, "Guess I can't rightly complain, considering you saved my hide back in that stampede." Evie's chest squeezed. They weren't leaving. They weren't turning on her. But Boone still hadn't said a word. When he finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. His horse's reins clenched tight in his fist, his expression dark, unreadable, and when he spoke his voice was low, rough. "You lied." Evie flinched, because this wasn't Boone being smug or teasing or exasperated. This was Boone Colton betrayed. "You played me for a fool," he continued, stepping closer. "Had me questioning my gut this whole damn time, wondering if I was wrong about you, about everything." His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. "But I wasn't wrong, was I? His voice was quiet now, but no less dangerous. "I just didn't know what it was you were hidin'." Evie's throat tightened. She couldn't lie now, couldn't spin some half-truth that would fix this. So she swallowed hard and met his gaze. "No," she whispered. "You weren't wrong." Boone exhaled sharply, shaking his head, running a hand through his hair like he couldn't believe this was happening. Then, after a long, terrible pause, "You should have told me." And somehow those words hurt worse than anything else he could have said, because Boone Colton wasn't just angry. He was hurt. And now she wasn't sure if he'd ever forgive her. The Wranglers had chosen their side. Evie had stood her ground. But Boone was a storm waiting to break. And worse, Luther Colton's men weren't done yet, because in the distance, beyond the dust, beyond the fading gunfire, more riders were coming. And this time, it was war. Chapter 4. Showdown and Sacrifice. The air was thick with dust, the midday heat pressing down like a hammer against an anvil. Every breath tasted like gunpowder and sweat, and the tension in the air crackled hotter than the sun overhead. Evie's heart slammed against her ribs, the weight of what was coming sinking into her bones. Because in the distance, riders were coming. Not just a few. Luther Colton had sent everything he had left, and this time he wasn't just here to scatter the herd, he was here to finish this. The first shot rang out before Evie could even call for the men to take position. A sharp crack, followed by the sharp yelp of a bullet striking wood, splintering the fence post beside her. Then chaos. The cattle bellowed and surged, their hooves pounding the earth in panic. Wranglers dove for cover, some drawing their weapons, others trying desperately to hold the herd together. And in the middle of it all, Boone Colton was still standing there, right between her and the men riding in. Evie's breath caught, but before she could think, before she could process what that meant, another shot rang out and everything exploded into motion. The first wave of hired guns came barreling in, their horses kicking up dirt as they fired wildly. Evie dove behind an overturned trough, yanking off a shot. Crack! One of the riders jerked in his saddle, his gun spinning from his hand as he tumbled into the dirt, but there were too many, and they were coming fast. Across the fray, Buck was cursing like hell, throwing punches as a rustler tried to rip him from his horse. Danny was down, not dead, thank God, but out cold in the dirt, and the cattle, dear Lord, the cattle were stampeding. Evie barely had time to move before the ground beneath her trembled, hooves churning up the dry earth like thunder on the horizon. Her breath hitched. She was in the path. If she didn't move, a body slammed into hers. Hard. She hit the ground with a force that knocked the breath clean from her lungs, dust filling her mouth, her ears ringing, and then a familiar voice, rough and dangerous as sin, right against her ear. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Evie gasped, blinking up at Boone. Because of course it was Boone, his broad frame shielding her from the stampede, his arms braced on either side of her as dirt and chaos swirled around them. His eyes were wild, his face dark with fury. She was too stunned to speak. Boone wasn't siding with them, he'd just saved her life. The stampede thundered past, dust choking the air. Boone stood hauling her up with him, his grip firm, unshakable. Evie barely had time to regain her footing before Luther Colton's second wave of men stormed in. And Boone, a gun still in his hand, and not pointing at her, at them. Luther's lead gunman jerked his horse to a stop, his expression darkening when he saw Boone standing at Evie's side. "The hell are you doing, Colton?" the man growled. Boone cocked his revolver. "Picking the right damn fight." The gunman's face twisted in rage, and Evie knew this was it. This was where everything changed. For Boone, for her, for all of them. And she wasn't sure if they were walking out of it alive. But she knew one thing. She wasn't standing alone anymore. The heat was relentless, shimmering off the dry plains like a fever dream. Dust clung to every surface, the cattle, the men, the very air itself. But no one dared move, because in that moment a single wrong breath could get them all killed. Evie stood in the center of it all. Her heart beat a furious drum in her chest. Across from her, Luther Colton's hired guns sat tense in their saddles, rifles raised, eyes shifting between her and Boone, like they weren't quite sure what to make of what had just happened. And Boone? Boone hadn't moved from her side. He was still standing there, his revolver steady, his broad frame half-angled between her and the danger, as if he were willing to take a bullet for her if it came to it. The knowledge shook her, more than she cared to admit. But she didn't have time to dwell on it, because right now it wasn't just her life at stake. It was Silver Creek, and she wasn't about to lose. Not now, not after all this. Luther's lead gunman spat into the dust, shifting in his saddle. You got a hell of a lot of nerve, girl. Evie lifted her chin. That so? Damn right, he growled. You think some fancy shootin' and a couple of big speeches are going to save you? Luther Colton owns this land now. The bank says so. Evie let out a low breath, and then she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was sharp. Because suddenly she wasn't just a rancher's daughter fighting for scraps. She was her father's daughter, and her father taught her better than this. Evie squared her shoulders. Actually, she said, that ain't quite true. The gunman's brows furrowed. The contract, Evie went on, keeping her voice calm, steady, sure, states that as long as we deliver this herd to the railhead on time, Silver Creek stays in our hands. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Evie pressed forward. And last I checked, we ain't late. The lead gunman scowled. Now, she said, you can kill me, maybe even scatter the herd. She lifted a brow. But you best believe the bank's going to have a real hard time explaining how the rightful landowner turned up dead right before meeting her contract terms. The men stilled. One of them muttered a curse under his breath. Evie took another step forward, her boots kicking up little clouds of dust. You work for Luther Colton, but that don't make you above the law, she continued. And if you cross this line today, I will personally make sure every single one of you swings for it. Silence. Then a chuckle, not from Luther's men, from Boone. Evie glanced sideways, and sure enough, the man had the audacity to grin. Damn, he murmured. Remind me never to play cards with you. Evie almost laughed. Almost. But she was too busy watching the way Luther's men were shifting now, muttering to each other, some looking downright uncomfortable, because they knew. She was right, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. The lead gunman turned his glare on Boone. You really throwing your lot in with her? He demanded. Going against your own blood? Boone exhaled, slow and even. Then, without breaking eye contact, he raised his revolver just a little higher. Looks that way, he said. The air went thick with tension. Then the gunman's lips curled. You just signed your own death warrant, Colton. Boone snorted. That's so. The gunman's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on his rifle. For a second, Evie thought he might be stupid enough to take the shot anyway, but then one of the men behind him turned his horse. Hell with this, the man muttered, spitting into the dust. Luther ain't paying me enough to swing for cattle fraud. Another followed, and another. Within seconds, more than half of Luther's hired men had peeled away, leaving only a handful still gripping their guns, uncertainty plain on their faces. The gunman's face twisted with fury, but even he knew the fight was lost. You tell your uncle, Ebby said, lifting her chin, that if he wants Silver Creek, he'll have to come take it himself. A long pause, then with a final glare the gunman wheeled his horse around and rode away. And just like that, it was over. The dust settled, the air shifted, and Evie realized her hands were shaking. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Buck let out a low whistle. Well, hell, girl, he muttered, shaking his head. You damn near scared me half to death. Evie let out a shaky laugh, but before she could respond, she felt a warm, solid presence beside her. "Boone?" He was still standing there, looking at her like she was a complete mystery he wasn't sure how to solve. Then, slowly, he smirked. "You ever think about going into politics?" Evie rolled her eyes, exhaustion creeping in. "Not unless it comes with a ranch and a good herd of cattle," Boone chuckled. "Fair enough." Then his smirk faded, just a little. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, softer. Evie swallowed, because for all her bravado, for all the fire and the fury she'd put into that fight, she wasn't sure, but she nodded anyway. Boone held her gaze a second longer. Then he reached out, quick, unexpected, and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Evie froze. Heat rushed through her, but before she could react, he had already turned away, and she was left standing there, watching him walk off, her heart thundering in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The battle was over. The herd was safe. Silver Creek was still hers. But now she had a whole new problem, because Boone Colton had chosen her side, and Evie wasn't sure what that meant for either of them. The heat bore down on them like a punishing hand, baking the earth and turning the trail into a shimmering, dusty expanse of exhaustion. The fight was over, but the real work wasn't. Because the herd, it still had to move. Evie took a shaky breath, her pulse still hammering from the confrontation. The weight of what had just happened, the gunfire, the standoff, Boone throwing his lot in with her, sat heavy in her chest. But she didn't have the luxury of stopping, not now. Not with Silver Creek still on the line. She turned to the crew, most of them still catching their breath, adjusting their grips on their reins, rubbing bruises and shaking off dust. "We ain't done yet," she called, straightening her spine. "We've got miles left to cover." A few of the men groaned, but Buck, bless him, chuckled under his breath. "Woman barely survives getting trampled, and she's already cracking the whip." Evie lifted a brow. "You got the energy to whine, you got the energy to ride," Buck snorted. "Ain't wrong." Boone, still astride his horse, his expression unreadable, exhaled through his nose. "She's right, we move now." And that was that. With a few weary groans and more than one muttered curse, the men swung back into action, because they were damn close now, and close didn't count if they didn't finish the job. The herd moved sluggishly at first, still rattled from the gunfire and dust storms kicked up by the fight. Evie rode along the flank, murmuring to the steers, guiding them with the same stubborn determination that had gotten her this far. Boone rode beside her, not speaking, not pushing, just there. She hated how much she noticed it. The silence between them wasn't the same as before. Before, Boone's silence had been that of a man watching, waiting. Now it felt like he was sorting through the wreckage of a decision he couldn't undo, and Evie wasn't sure if she wanted to know what conclusion he was coming to. The heat didn't let up. They rode until the light began to shift, the scorching gold of midday giving way to the deep oranges and purples of late afternoon. The herd moved steadier now, the scent of railhead pastures close enough for even the cattle to sense. Evie should have felt relieved. She should have been giddy at the sight of the distant smokestacks, the promise of the train station that would mark the end of this fight. But all she could think about was the man riding beside her, and how nothing between them would ever be simple again. Finally, Boone spoke. "We need to talk." Evie kept her eyes forward. "Ain't much to say." Boone let out a low breath, something like a laugh, but without any humour. "Ain't that suffin'? Spent the whole drive pryin' words out of you, and now you're the one who don't want to talk." Evie's jaw tightened, because she knew where this was heading. Knew what he was going to say. "You lied. You tricked me. You put me in a position I never wanted to be in." And he wouldn't be wrong. But she didn't regret it. Not for one damn second. They rode into the outskirts of the railhead just as the sun hit the horizon, the air shifting to that particular evening coolness that came after a long, sweltering day. The station was bustling, the distant clang of iron, the hiss of steam, and the low murmur of cowboys and merchants blending into the background as they steered the cattle into the final holding pens. They had made it. The herd was delivered. Silver Creek was still hers, and Boone Colton, he was still here. Evie swung down from her saddle, dust puffing up around her boots as she landed. She ran a hand over her face, trying to scrub away some of the exhaustion settling into her bones. And when she looked up, Boone was watching her, his face unreadable, his eyes anything but. And Evie knew whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. Not for either of them. The battle for Silver Creek was won. But Evie and Boone, their war was just getting started, because now they had to face the aftermath, the legal battles, the consequences, and worse, the truth between them, and there wasn't a single gun in the world that could protect them from that. The railhead town was alive with noise and movement, the clamour of cattle, merchants, and train whistles blending into a chaotic symphony of dust and sweat. Evie stood at the fence of the holding pens, watching as the last of her herd was tallied and accounted for. Her herd, her father's legacy, and now her victory. The relief hit her so fast she had to press a hand to the fence just to keep her knees from buckling. They had made it, despite the heat, despite the rustlers, despite Boone Colton and all the damned emotions that came tangled up with him. Silver Creek was saved. Now all she had to do was make sure she walked away with what she was owed. The railhead buyer, a thick-necked, barrel-chested man named Mr. Fowler, stood with his ledger, double-checking the numbers as the cattle were counted. Evie tapped her boot against the dirt, impatient but steady. Fowler finally turned to her, grunting. "Good-sized herd, Miss Chandler." Evie folded her arms. "Damn right it is." That earned her a chuckle. "Price is high this season," Fowler continued. "You're in luck." Evie lifted a brow. "Luck had nothing to do with it." That got a bigger laugh, but her stomach stayed tight, because the number on that final contract mattered more than anything. Fowler scrawled something onto the paper, then turned and handed it over. Evie's heart pounded as she took it. She ran her eyes over the final sum, counted it twice, then again just to be sure, and then she let out the breath she'd been holding for months. It was enough. Enough to clear the debts, enough to keep Silver Creek where it belonged. Evie tipped her hat back, staring up at the sky, blinking away the sudden, burning prick behind her eyes. She'd done it, against every single odds stacked against her. She'd done it, and suddenly the exhaustion was worth it. The bruises, the lies, even Boone Colton standing across the yard watching her like he still wasn't sure if he should be proud or damn well furious. All of it. Worth it. She should have known he'd come to find her. Evie had barely finished signing the contract before she felt his presence behind her, heat curling low in her stomach before he even spoke. "You did it." She exhaled, rolling her shoulders before turning to face him. "Damn right I did." Boone's lips tugged into something that wasn't quite a smile, his hat tilted low against the afternoon sun. But his eyes were serious, and Evie wasn't ready for that. Not now, not when she could still feel the ghost of his hands on her, shielding her from stampeding hooves. Not when she could still hear the gunfire, see him standing beside her instead of against her. "You here to gloat, Colton?" Boone exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "No." She lifted a brow. Boone shifted, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "I'm here to tell you—" He trailed off, then let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. "Hell, Evie, I don't know what the hell I'm doing." That made two of them. Boone took a slow step forward, his gaze locking onto hers, sharp and sure. "I had my orders," he admitted. "Bessemer told me to make sure this drive failed. Told me to let you lose everything." Evie's stomach clenched, but she didn't interrupt. "But when it came down to it—" Boone exhaled, shaking his head. "I couldn't do it." Silence stretched between them, thick with things neither of them wanted to say but needed to. I told myself I was just sticking around to see if you'd fail on your own. Boone continued, his voice quieter now. I told myself I wasn't picking sides. He huffed out another laugh, shaking his head. But I was lying to myself? Evie felt her heart twist, because Boone Colton wasn't a man who lied. Not to himself, not to anyone. She swallowed. Why? Boone's eyes softened, the edges of his usual cocky smirk slipping away, leaving behind something raw. You know why? Evie's breath caught. Because she did. She had known for a while now, probably since the moment he first looked at her and saw more than just a stubborn rancher in a hat too big for her head. Evie shook her head. Boone. I ain't expecting anything, he cut in, voice rough, like this was the hardest thing he'd ever admitted. Not after everything, but I need you to know. I didn't stay because of my uncle. His jaw ticked, his eyes fierce with something she wasn't sure she could handle right now. I stayed because of you. Evie's chest ached. Because what was she supposed to say to that, to a man who had every reason to leave, to betray her, but didn't? To a man who had thrown away his own blood ties, his own future, to stand by her side? She shook her head. You're a fool, Boone Colton. Boone smiled just a little, something soft around the edges. Yeah, guess I am. Evie exhaled, her hands shaking just enough for her to hate herself for it. She wasn't ready for this, for him, for what it meant. But when Boone stepped closer, his rough fingers ghosting over the side of her face, she didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't do a damn thing except stand there and let herself feel it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Silver Creek was safe, the cattle were sold, but Boone Colton was still here, and Evie had no idea what to do about that. Because this wasn't a fight she could win with grit and gunfire. This was something else entirely, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to let herself lose. The railhead town bustled with life, the air thick with the mingling sense of dust, cattle, and fried food from a nearby cook-fire. The sun had started its slow descent, casting long shadows over the holding pens, and yet Evie still couldn't quite let herself relax. She should have been celebrating. The herd was sold, Silver Creek was safe, and yet her nerves felt frayed, her body too used to tension to settle into relief. She let out a slow breath, adjusting the brim of her hat, her gaze sweeping over the busy streets. Something was missing, and then the familiar creak of wagon wheels hit her ears. Evie froze. She turned just in time to see a battered old buckboard rolling into town, its driver gripping the reins in a way that made her stomach twist. Because she knew that grip, knew those strong, calloused hands. The wagon rolled to a stop, and before she could even fully process it, Jed Chandler was climbing down. Evie's boots moved before her brain caught up, the distance between them disappearing in a blur of dust and disbelief. Pa? Jed turned, and for a second she saw the father she'd always known, tough, grizzled, worn around the edges, but as soon as his eyes landed on her, something broke. His expression shifted, the usual stubborn set of his jaw giving way to relief so raw it nearly knocked her breathless. "Damn it, girl," he muttered, his voice hoarse with something he'd never been good at saying out loud. Then, before she could speak, before she could even think, he wrapped his arms around her, and Evie stilled, because Jed Chandler was not a man who hugged, not often, not easily, but here he was, holding on to her like she'd just come back from the dead. And Evie, who had spent weeks fighting like hell to prove she could do this on her own, found herself gripping the back of his worn shirt like she was 12 years old again, clinging to him after she'd fallen off a horse. Her throat tightened. "Pa," she managed, voice muffled against his chest. Jed pulled back, eyes scanning her like he needed to see for himself that she was in one piece. Then he huffed. "You look like hell." Evie snorted, swiping at her dusty face. "Well, that makes two of us." That earned her a raspy chuckle, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Evie saw something soft in her father's face, something she hadn't realized she'd been waiting to see. Pride. Jed exhaled, planting his hands on his hips. "Heard about the standoff?" Evie tensed. "That's so?" Jed lifted a brow. "That's so?" he echoed. "Ed, my girl, took on a bunch of armed men, faced down Luther Colton's thugs, and still made it out with every damn head of cattle." Evie felt a flush of something unfamiliar creep up her neck. "Wasn't just me," she muttered, scuffing the toe of her boot in the dirt. "Had help." Jed's eyes flicked over to where Boone stood near the pens, watching them from a distance, his usual cocky smirk replaced with something quieter. Jed hummed. "Yeah, I imagine you did." Evie swallowed. "So, you mad?" Jed's gaze snapped back to hers. "Mad?" He let out a gruff laugh, shaking his head. "Hell no!" Evie blinked. That was not what she expected. "I was scared out of my damn mind," Jed admitted, rubbing at his jaw. "Figured I'd have to come down here and drag your stubborn hide home." Evie lifted her chin. "Wouldn't have worked." Jed smirked. "Nope, I don't reckon it would have." He paused, exhaling through his nose before shaking his head. "But you did it, Evie." Evie's stomach clenched. "You did the impossible," he continued, his voice quieter now, full of something that made her chest ache. "You proved me wrong." Evie's breath hitched. She didn't know why hearing it made her want to cry. She hadn't needed his approval, hadn't needed him to say it out loud. She'd done this for Silver Creek, for herself, for the legacy that meant everything to her, and yet, knowing her father saw her, truly saw her for who she was now, it felt like something slotting into place, something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Evie swallowed hard, forcing the lump in her throat back where it belonged. "Well," she muttered, adjusting her hat, "I sure as hell ain't gonna say I told you so." Jed snorted. "Good! I would have smacked you upside the head." Evie laughed, and for the first time in a long time it was easy. As the last rays of sun flickered over the railhead, Evie watched as her men, her crew, unloaded supplies, settled horses, and laughed despite their exhaustion. Silver Creek was waiting for them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Evie felt ready to go home. Jed nudged her shoulder. "You coming back with me?" Evie hesitated. Her gaze flickered over to Boone, who was still standing near the pens, watching her like he was waiting for something. Like maybe he wasn't sure if she was going to ride off before they figured out whatever was between them. Evie's stomach twisted, but she pushed it aside. For now. She turned back to her father and nodded. "Yeah, Pa," she said, feeling the words settle in her bones. "I'm coming home." The fight was over. But Evie's real life, the one where she wasn't pretending to be anyone but herself, that was just beginning. And as she stole one last glance at Boone Colton, she had the strangest feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done with her yet. The sky stretched wide and endless, a canvas of gold and blue, the air crisp with the scent of fresh hay, leather, and the promise of a new beginning. Silver Creek Ranch had never looked more alive. The corrals were full again, cattle well fed and steady, no longer half-starved and skittish. The barn doors hung straight, the fences mended, the ranch house standing strong just like it always had. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. It was the way the men looked at her. No more skeptical glances. No more whispers behind her back, wondering if she could handle the weight of running this place. They tipped their hats when she passed. They nodded with respect. And Evie, she felt it. Deep in her bones, she belonged here, not as Jed Chandler's daughter, not as a woman pretending to be something she wasn't, but as Evie Chandler, rancher, boss. She strode across the ranch yard, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust, the morning sun warming the land around her. Buck stood near the fenced paddock watching as a few of the younger hands wrestled with an ornery calf that had no intention of cooperating. Buck grinned when he saw her. "Well, hell," he said, pushing his hat back. "Look who's strutting in, like she owns the place." Evie lifted a brow. "Pretty sure I do." Buck let out a deep chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn right you do." Evie exhaled, surveying everything they'd fought for. The barn, restocked with fresh supplies, the corrals brimming with new cattle, healthy and strong, the men working with purpose, not just because it was a job, but because this place mattered again. Evie's throat tightened. She had dreamed of this moment. But now that it was here, it felt bigger than she'd imagined. She had fought, and she had won. And now she was home. As she walked toward the main house, one of the younger wranglers, Danny, hurried up beside her, his hat in his hands. "Miss Chandler?" Evie blinked at him. "Miss Chandler? Not Evan? Not Kid, Miss Chandler?" She swallowed hard and squared her shoulders. "Yeah?" Danny shifted on his feet, looking a little sheepish. "Just wanted to say, reckon I didn't make things easy on you." "None of us did." Evie tilted her head, studying the young man. Danny wasn't much younger than her, but he'd been one of the loudest voices questioning her place before the drive. Now he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than standing in front of her, admitting this. She let him stew for a second, just for fun. Then she smirked. "You were a pain in the ass, Danny." Danny snorted. "Yeah, I was." Then, more serious, "But you did right by us, Miss Chandler, and I'm glad you're still here." Evie felt a slow warmth spread in her chest. She reached out, clapped a hand against his shoulder. "Well," she said, voice lighter now, "just try not to be so slow on the next cattle drive. That was downright embarrassing." Danny laughed, tipping his hat. "Yes, Mom." And just like that, everything had changed. Not because of what she'd done, but because she had proved without a doubt that she could lead. And the men, they had followed. Evie had just reached the steps of the ranch house when she felt it. That familiar presence, that weight in the air that came whenever Boone Colton was nearby. She didn't turn around, didn't need to, because somehow she knew. He was watching her, like he had been for days. Ever since they left the railhead. Ever since he chose her, the problem was, she still didn't know what to do about it. Silver Creek was reborn, Evie was exactly where she belonged. But now she had to figure out where Boone Colton fit in that picture. Because the fight for Silver Creek was over, but the fight for her heart, that was just beginning. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh grass, sun-warmed earth, and just a hint of hope. Overhead the sky stretched wide and blue, a promise of a new beginning under the expansive western sky. Evie stood on the porch of the ranch house, her eyes sweeping over Silver Creek. The land was alive. Cattle grazing contentedly in the pastures, ranch hands busy with their morning chores, and the distant ring of a hammer from the barn where repairs were well underway. This was her home, and it was finally hers again. But something still lingered. Unfinished business. And his name was Boone Colton. Evie spotted Boone leaning against the corral fence, one boot propped on the bottom rail, his hat tipped low to shield his eyes from the morning sun. He looked perfectly at ease, like he hadn't just thrown his lot in with her and risked the wrath of his uncle. But she knew Boone better than that. Behind that casual slouch was a man who didn't do anything without a reason. Sighing, Evie squared her shoulders and made her way over, her boots crunching against the gravel. Boone didn't turn around, but she knew he heard her. His posture straightened just a fraction, a barely there tension in his shoulders. "You know, Boone," she called out, "for a man who just upended his whole life, you look mighty relaxed." Boone chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent a little shiver down her spine. "Well, Evie, some of us were born to make trouble. He turned, tipping his hat up just enough to reveal his mischievous grin. "And it seems I found just the right person to help me stir the pot." She crossed her arms, trying to ignore the way her heart picked up its pace. "And here I thought you were done with the Colton name." Boone's smile faded a bit, his expression growing serious. "I'm done with Luther's kind of Colton," he said, "but that doesn't mean the Coltons can't stand for something better." Evie raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly does better look like to you?" Boone shifted his weight, turning to look out over the adjoining parcel of land, a stretch of fertile grazing ground that bordered Silver Creek and Colton territory. "It looks like a partnership," he said, "between Silver Creek and Colton land, between your family and what's left of mine." Evie narrowed her eyes. "You proposing some kind of truce?" "Something like that." Boone met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I'll take on managing the adjoining parcel. Keep an eye on things. Make sure Luther's old habits don't linger. It's good land, Evie. With the right care, it could benefit both of us." She studied him, her mind racing. On the surface, it sounded like a practical arrangement, a way to bridge the gap between their two families to ensure peace moving forward. But this was Boone Colton, and nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, tilting her head. Boone's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "A chance to start over, maybe? To prove that a Colton can stand for something other than greed and sabotage?" He paused, then added with a glint of humour, And maybe it'll give me a reason to stick around and keep an eye on you. Make sure you don't go getting yourself into any more trouble." Evie snorted. Me? Trouble? If I recall, you're the one with a knack for stirring the pot." "Guilty as charged," Boone drawled, his eyes twinkling. "But you got to admit, you make trouble look good." Evie felt a blush creep up her neck, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Instead, she rolled her eyes. "All right, Colton, you want to play rancher and keep an eye on your uncle's old land? Fine. But if you think for a second I'm going to let you get away with slacking off, you've got another thing coming." Boone's grin widened. "Wouldn't dream of it." Together they walked along the fence line, discussing the logistics of their new arrangement. Boone outlined his plans for rotating the cattle, fixing up the old Colton barns, and planting crops that could sustain the land during the harsh seasons. Evie listened, impressed despite herself. Boone might have been trouble, but he knew his way around a ranch. More importantly, he understood the land, what it needed to thrive, how to work with it instead of against it. "You know," she said as they reached the edge of the property, "you almost sound like you know what you're doing." Boone laughed, the sound easy and warm. "Don't go spreading that around, Evie. I got a reputation to uphold." She smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." They stood in companionable silence, the breeze whispering through the grass, the distant lowing of cattle a familiar backdrop. Finally Boone turned to her, his expression sincere. "Thank you, Evie, for giving me a chance, for trusting me." She met his gaze, her own voice softening. "Don't make me regret it, Colton." He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Wouldn't dare." Evie chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of possibility, of hope for the future. Silver Creek was safe, the land was thriving, and for the first time in a long while there was peace between the Chandlers and the Coltons. Maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something new, something better. And with Boone at her side, trouble or not, she found she didn't mind the idea one bit. Silver Creek was entering a new chapter, one of growth, of partnership, of unexpected alliances. And Evie? She was ready to see what came next. With Boone Colton and his irreverent charm by her side, she had a feeling it was going to be one hell of a ride. The sky stretched wide, awash in the deep golds and purples of sunset, casting long shadows over the land. The air smelled of warm earth and fading summer, carrying the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic creak of saddle leather. Evie sat astride her horse at the crest of the ridge, looking out over Silver Creek Ranch, her home, her legacy, her hard-won future. It had never looked so beautiful, and she had never felt so whole. But the thing about sunsets, they were better shared. Which was why she wasn't surprised when Boone Colton's horse came up alongside hers, his easy, lazy confidence somehow still present, even in the golden hush of evening. "Was starting to think you'd run off," she said, keeping her eyes on the horizon. Boone chuckled, shifting in his saddle. "Now, why would I do a damn fool thing like that?" Eva finally turned to look at him, taking in his dark, wind-ruffled hair, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, and the easy way he sat like he belonged to this land as much as she did. She should have known from the start he was going to be trouble, and yet she didn't mind it one bit. For a long moment neither of them spoke, just watching as the sun dipped lower, turning the land into a canvas of deep amber and blue. Finally, Boone let out a slow breath. "You fought like hell for this place," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "For your family, for your future." Evie swallowed. "Yeah." Boone studied her, something unreadable flickering behind those grey-blue eyes. "And what about you, Evie?" he asked. "Now that the fight's over, what do you want?" The question hit harder than she expected. Because she'd spent so long fighting, proving herself, pushing forward, she hadn't allowed herself to think much beyond it, beyond this, beyond him. Her fingers tightened on the reins, but before she could answer, Boone nudged his horse closer. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think the smartest thing I could do was keep my distance from you." Evie snorted. "That worked real well." Boone grinned, slow and wicked. "Yeah. Didn't last long, did it?" She smirked. "Not even a little." Boone exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't scare easy, Evie. Never have." He met her gaze, his voice turning rough, honest. "But you scared the hell out of me." Evie's heart clenched, because this right here, was real. Boone Colton, always so sure of himself, always so quick with a smirk and a cocky remark, was laying himself bare for her. And Lord help her, she was doing the same. She reached over, her fingers skimming along his forearm, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady strength beneath it. "I think," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the breeze. "You scare me too?" Boone's lips tipped up just slightly. "Good." Then, before she could overthink it, before she could talk herself out of it, she leaned in, and Boone met her halfway. The kiss was slow, like the way dusk settled over the land. Gradual, inevitable, impossible to ignore. Boone's lips were warm and sure, his touch gentle but firm, as if he knew exactly how much weight she carried and wasn't afraid to hold it with her. When they finally pulled apart, Boone exhaled softly, pressing his forehead to hers. "Reckon I'm in trouble," he murmured. Evie grinned. "Reckon you are." Then, before she could say another word, Boone nudged his horse forward. A challenge. A dare. Evie didn't hesitate. With a laugh, she kicked her horse into motion, the two of them racing across the open land, the wind catching in their hair, the sound of hoofbeats and laughter carrying through the twilight. It wasn't a ballroom waltz, but it was theirs. And for Evie, it was perfect, because Silver Creek was hers, and so was Boone Colton. As they slowed to a trot, Boone reached over, looping his pinky around hers, a quiet, simple promise. Evie squeezed back. She didn't need words, not now, because for the first time in a long time she wasn't just fighting for something, she was living it. And for a woman who had spent her whole life chasing a dream, she'd finally caught it.